Grandfather Parado. Imagine a reality where time travel is not just the domain of science fiction, but an actual tangible phenomenon. You stand before a machine, a marvel of human ingenuity that promises to carry you backward through time's veil. Driven by curiosity or a deep personal quest, you activate this device and journey into the past. Your destination, a moment long before your birth, a time when your grandfather was still a young man, full of dreams and untouched by the life that would one day unfold. At first, your presence in this earlier age is surreal, an echo moving among shadows that are unaware of their significance. You seek out your grandfather, not as the aged figure in family photographs, but as a vibrant young individual, alive with the pulse of a different era. But in this altered state of history, a moment unfolds, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps through a chain of choices you barely perceive, where you prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother. A glance never exchanged, a path not crossed, a destiny quietly unwoven. The implications crash into you like a tidal wave. If your grandparents never met, your parents could not have been born. And if they were never born, then neither were you. But if you were never born, how could you have traveled back in time at all? Who, then, was it that prevented their meeting? This is the heart of the grandfather paradox, a logical snarl that twists time into an impossible knot. It dares us to imagine a scenario where cause and effect collapse upon themselves. Your action in the past negates the very future from which you came. You become a contradiction, a ghost haunting a timeline that should never have known you. The paradox lies in the recursive loop you have created. By altering a foundational event, you have invalidated your own existence. Yet that non-existent self is precisely who altered the event. It is a riddle that resists resolution, a loop with no beginning and no end. This thought experiment, though fantastical, is a cornerstone in the philosophical exploration of time travel. It forces us to reconsider the nature of causality, our most trusted framework for understanding change. If the past can be altered in a way that erases the future, then how stable is time? Can history truly be rewritten? Or is it, in some fundamental sense, immutable? Some suggest an escape from the paradox through the concept of parallel timelines or branching universes. According to this theory, your time-traveling interference does not rewrite your own past, but rather births a new, divergent timeline, a fork in the multiversal road. In this new branch, your grandparents never meet, and you are never born. Yet, in the original timeline, untouched by your actions, you still exist, safely insulated from the consequences of your intervention. This multiverse solution offers a way out of the logical impasse. It preserves both the event and its undoing by separating them into different realities. Each universe becomes a self-contained narrative, coherent within its own internal logic, thus evading contradiction. But this explanation, elegant as it may be, raises further questions. If timelines multiply with every action, what becomes of identity? What moral weight does your decision carry if it spawns a reality filled with suffering or loss? Another resolution comes from the theory of closed time-like curves, concepts rooted in Einstein's equations of general relativity. In such a scenario, time is a loop rather than a line. Events are predestined, bound by the consistency of the timeline. If you travel to the past, you can only do so in ways that maintain the timeline's coherence. Perhaps you attempted to prevent your grandfather's meeting, but fate, or physics, intervened. A twist of chance, a failed plan, or even your own subconscious preserves the timeline. In this view, the universe protects itself from paradox. This model is profoundly deterministic. It suggests that free will may be an illusion, particularly when one meddles with time. You are not an agent of change, but a participant in a story that has already been written, your role etched into history with indelible ink. And yet, the grandfather paradox remains more than a scientific curiosity or a narrative device. It touches something deeper in us, our yearning to undo past regrets, to reclaim moments we've lost, to save those we could not save. In the paradox, we encounter the terrifying and beautiful fragility of existence, the realization that our lives hinge on countless moments of chance and causality, each irreplaceable, each woven into a grand and unalterable design. Even in popular culture, the grandfather paradox has found fertile ground. Films, novels, and television, shows use it as a dramatic fulcrum, a device to explore the consequences of altering the past. But these portrayals also serve a philosophical function. They invite audiences to engage with the paradox not just intellectually, but emotionally. What would you risk to change the past? And could you live with the consequences? Science offers both hope and caution. Theoretical physics allows for time travel under exotic conditions, wormholes, cosmic strings, or the manipulation of space-time. Yet with every possibility, there are constraints, infinite energy requirements, instability, and the risk of paradox. Some scientists believe that the laws of the universe might conspire to prevent such contradictions from arising. An invisible hand that guides events away from inconsistency. In this light, the grandfather paradox becomes not just a barrier to time travel, but a guardian of reality. It may be that paradoxes like this are nature's way of saying, some things must remain unchangeable. Philosophically, the paradox also calls into question our understanding of identity and continuity. If your past changes and you cease to exist, does that negate your experiences, your choices, your consciousness? Are you the same person if the chain of causality that led to your birth is severed? The grandfather paradox forces us to grapple with the essence of what it means to be and to have been. Ultimately, the grandfather paradox invites us to stand at the threshold of what is possible and stare into the unknown. It is both a warning and a wonder, a reminder that our desire to command time must be tempered by humility. The past is not just a series of events, it is the foundation of our being. To unmake it is to unmake ourselves. Whether time travel ever becomes more than speculation, the grandfather paradox will endure, as a mirror held up to our assumptions, our desires, and our understanding of the universe. It tells us that even in the age of science, some mysteries remain sacred, protected by the very contradictions that make them unsolvable. Foundations and variations. In the realm of logic and philosophy, few puzzles have endured like the liar's paradox, a deceptively simple statement that shakes the foundations of truth, language, and self-reference. It begins with a sentence, as brief as it is bewildering. This statement is false. At first glance, it appears to be just another abstract musing, the sort of thought experiment confined to academic debate. But as one unpacks its layers, the contradiction at its heart emerges. If the statement is true, then what it asserts must hold, meaning the statement is false. Yet, if it is false, then it is not the case that this statement is false, which would make it true. The sentence collapses into a loop, eternally reversing its own claim. Truth becomes indistinguishable from falsehood, and meaning begins to dissolve. This paradox is not merely a linguistic oddity. It represents a critical fault line in the structure of logic, a deep chasm that opens when language is allowed to refer to itself. It challenges the binary worldview of classical logic, where every proposition must be either true or false. The liar's paradox exists in defiance of that system, occupying a space where truth values can no longer be neatly assigned. Its origins stretch back to antiquity. One of the earliest known versions was posited by Epimenides, a Cretan philosopher, who famously stated, "All Cretans are liars." Since he himself was a Cretan, the declaration is ensnared in self-reference. If all Cretans lie, then Epimenides is lying. But if he is lying, then perhaps not all Cretans are liars. This circular logic is a seed from which countless variations of the liar's paradox have grown. As philosophical inquiry matured, so too did the forms in which the paradox was expressed. The modern distillation, "This statement is false," cuts through embellishment and exposes the core dilemma. It is a linguistic Mobius strip, a sentence twisted upon itself in a way that eludes resolution. But the paradox is not static, it evolves. Consider the next variation. "This statement is neither true nor false." Here the tension increases. Classical logic, again, has no place for this ambiguity. A statement must land on one side of the line, true or false. But this version insists on existing outside that dichotomy. It becomes a rebel in the realm of truth, defying classification, daring us to invent a broader framework that can contain it. More intricate still are networks of statements, each referring to the others in a tangled web of self-reference. Imagine statement A says, statement B is false, and statement B asserts, statement A is true. What emerges is a kind of logical dance, where each step depends on the last and the music never resolves. These interconnected liar structures deepen the puzzle, showing that the issue is not merely with a single mischievous sentence, but with the very notion of self-reference itself. Such constructs are not merely intellectual playthings. They point to foundational cracks in the edifice of formal reasoning. In traditional logical systems, especially those employed in mathematics and computer science, consistency is paramount. Yet, the liar's paradox demonstrates how easy it is for systems to buckle when faced with statements that double back on themselves. Indeed, when mathematician Kurt Gödel introduced his incompleteness theorems in the early 20th century, he drew upon similar ideas. He crafted statements within formal systems that essentially say, this statement cannot be proven true within this system. If the system could prove the statement, it would be inconsistent. If it couldn't, it would be incomplete. Either way, the paradox revealed an unavoidable truth. No sufficiently powerful formal system can be both complete and consistent. In this way, the liar's paradox became a quiet architect of modern mathematics, shaping how we understand the limits of formal proof. But the implications extend far beyond mathematics. In language and semantics, the paradox asks us to reconsider how meaning is constructed. When a sentence refers to itself, does it transcend ordinary usage? Does it become a kind of linguistic mirror, folding syntax into an infinite regress? The paradox reveals how language can be used to undermine itself, subverting its own rules, and forcing us to confront the limitations of expression. In the realm of linguistics, this has led to the study of metalanguage, a language used to describe another language. To avoid paradox, systems often establish a hierarchy. The base language says one thing, the metalanguage speaks about it, and a meta-metalanguage may describe the metalanguage, and so on. This stratification seeks to prevent self-reference, to shield meaning from the recursion that births contradiction. But even this structure is not immune. In moments of poetic or philosophical ambition, language often breaks free from these constraints, and the risk of paradox returns. The liar's paradox, therefore, is more than a curiosity. It is a mirror held up to human reason. It shows us that even our most sacred constructs, truth, logic, language, are vulnerable to fracture. It whispers that the universe of thought is more complex than our structures can fully contain. In practical terms, the paradox has influenced disciplines from computer science to theology. In programming, recursion, functions that call themselves, is both a tool and a danger. If not carefully bounded, recursive logic can result in infinite loops, systems that freeze or crash under the weight of self-reference. Debugging such a loop is akin to untying the liar's knot. Each solution reveals another entanglement. The paradox thus serves as both a guide and a warning to those who design systems of logic and function. Philosophically, it poses questions that resonate through discussions of truth and reality. Can something be both true and false? Must every statement be judged by a binary standard? Or is there space in logic for degrees, for ambiguity, for paradox itself? Some thinkers, such as proponents of dialetheism, argue that contradictions can, in some cases, be true. A statement can be both true and false simultaneously. This view, radical to traditional logic, offers a home for the liar's paradox, though it does so at the cost of abandoning classical consistency. As we draw this first part to a close, the liar's paradox stands not as a riddle to be solved, but as a phenomenon to be understood. It is a landmark on the map of human thought, marking the border between clarity and chaos. Its persistence across millennia is testament to its depth and to the enduring human quest to define the undefinable. Implications in logic, philosophy, and beyond. Having traced the foundational shape and variations of the liar's paradox, we now turn to its deeper implications, those that ripple out from philosophy into formal logic, language, computer science, and even the human experience of truth itself. What begins as a sentence, "This statement is false," unfolds into a profound confrontation with the limits of reason. In logic, the liar's paradox strikes at the law of the excluded middle, the principle that every proposition is either true or false. This binary structure has long underpinned our understanding of logical reasoning. Yet the liar's sentence stubbornly refuses to conform. It reveals the fragility of any system that insists on mutual exclusivity between truth and falsehood. A statement that negates itself is both, and neither. To resolve this, some philosophers and logicians have proposed alternative logical frameworks. One such response is three-valued logic, or multi-valued logic, where a third truth value, often labeled undefined or indeterminate, joins true and false. In this system, paradoxical statements can be assigned this third status, acknowledging that they do not resolve within classical parameters. The paradox is not solved, per se, but absorbed into a broader, more tolerant architecture. More radically, paraconsistent logic allows contradictions to exist without collapsing the entire logical system. In classical logic, the presence of one contradiction implies everything is true, a catastrophe known as explosion. But paraconsistent systems resist this. They allow contradictions like the liar's paradox to remain present, localized, and non-destructive. Dialetheism, a philosophical stance built on paraconsistent logic, accepts that some contradictions are true. According to this view, the liar's paradox is not a problem, but a revelation, a glimpse into a reality where truth is not always clean or separable. This approach challenges deeply ingrained intuitions and has been both embraced and fiercely resisted within philosophical circles. Beyond logic, the liar's paradox shakes the philosophy of language. It exposes the complications of self-reference, where language turns back on itself like a serpent eating its tail. This recursion, while poetic, can also be corrosive. In semantics, truth-conditional theories, those that define meaning through conditions under which statements are true, run into problems when those conditions involve the statement itself. To manage this, Tarski's hierarchy of languages was introduced. Polish logician Alfred Tarski proposed that a language must not contain its own truth predicate. That is, if you want to make statements about truth, you must step into a metalanguage. For example, if English contains a statement, this statement is false, we cannot resolve its truth value in English. We must speak in a meta-English, one level up, to discuss its truth. This prevents paradox, but at a cost. It severs the language from total self-sufficiency. The cost is philosophical as well. Tarski's solution removes the paradox by restricting self-reference, but life does not afford such luxury. Our natural languages are self-referential all the time. We reflect on our own thoughts, question our own reasoning, evaluate our own values. Self-reference is embedded in consciousness itself. This brings us to a broader terrain, the liar's paradox as a metaphor for human cognition. Just as the paradox undoes logical certainty, so too do humans sometimes find themselves trapped in conflicting beliefs, recursive doubts, and unstable identities. The paradox is not just about statements, it is about selves. In psychology and cognitive science, recursive thinking, thinking about thinking, is both a marker of intelligence and a potential source of psychological tension. We are aware of our own thoughts, capable of analyzing them, and even of doubting the analysis. This meta-awareness, though powerful, can also lead to loops of indecision, anxiety, and paradoxical reasoning. Just as the liar statement cannot settle into a single truth value, neither can the human mind always rest in certainty. Consider the phenomenon of imposter syndrome. A person may succeed but think, "I don't deserve this success." That thought may itself be doubted. Maybe I'm wrong to think I don't deserve it. And then another layer. But if I'm wrong to think that, then maybe I do deserve it, except that I'm still doubting. This recursive structure mirrors the liar sentence, oscillating, unresolved, self-consuming. The liar's paradox also reverberates in theology and metaphysics. It is invoked in discussions of divine omniscience and the limits of God's knowledge. Can an all-knowing being know a statement that defies resolution? Can a truth that is also a falsehood be known in full? Or must some truths lie beyond even divine cognition? In theology, this extends into paradoxes of omnipotence, like the classic question, can God create a rock so heavy that even he cannot lift it? These formulations, while distinct, share the liar's flavor, language engineered to collapse on itself, to test the borders of power, knowledge, and coherence. In computer science, the liar's paradox is more than conceptual, it is operational. Self-referential logic forms the basis of recursive functions, and if those functions are improperly defined, they lead to infinite loops. This is no mere theory. It is a practical risk, a bug that can crash systems. The paradox teaches caution to those who write the rules that machines must follow. It is a reminder that even machines, in their perfect obedience, are vulnerable to the snares of logic. Programs designed to process language or analyze truth must be shielded from paradoxical inputs. In artificial intelligence and formal knowledge systems, semantic paradoxes must be anticipated and neutralized. Failing to do so can result in catastrophic failure, or at least a system frozen in an endless search for resolution. The liar's paradox, then, is more than a statement. It is a force, philosophical, logical, linguistic, cognitive, technological. It surfaces wherever systems try to represent themselves within themselves. It is the echo chamber's ghost, the feedback loop's sting, the unresolved recursion in the heart of reason. Culturally, the paradox appears in literature and art as a symbol of existential tension. Writers use it to explore themes of deception, authenticity, and duality. In fiction, paradoxes challenge not only characters but readers, inviting them into a dance of uncertainty. Poets wrap it in metaphor. Painters hint at it with impossible forms. Musicians suggest it with motifs that never quite resolve. Across media, the liar's paradox becomes a symbol of the unspeakable, the truth that undoes itself the moment it is uttered. Even in moral philosophy, the paradox finds analogues. Ethical dilemmas sometimes hinge on contradictory imperatives. Do this, but also do that, which negates the first. In such situations, moral reasoning must navigate through paradox, choosing action despite the impossibility of a clear ethical resolution. Ultimately, the liar's paradox reveals the limits of structure. Whether the structure is language, logic, morality, or consciousness, there comes a point where it must confront itself. And in that moment, the rules bend, the definitions slip, and the system trembles. Yet, this is not necessarily a failing. Paradox can be generative. It can signal when new understanding is needed. Just as Gödel's paradoxical insight led to breakthroughs in mathematical theory, just as recursive functions birthed the digital world, so too can the liar's paradox illuminate new paths in thought. Perhaps the true gift of the liar's paradox is not in being solved, but in being engaged. It invites humility. It cautions against certainty. It reminds us that language, logic, and even self-knowledge are works in progress, never final, always recursive, ever deeper. In the end, the liar's paradox does not simply tell us, this statement is false. It whispers something more profound, that within every structure, every truth, every self-contained system, there lies the seed of its own undoing. And in that undoing, a doorway to something greater. Identity and gradual change. Among the most enduring philosophical puzzles about identity and continuity, the ship of Theseus paradox stands like a weathered vessel upon the waves of thought. It invites us to imagine a ship, a grand and storied vessel once captained by the hero Theseus. Over time, its wooden parts begin to rot and are replaced, plank by plank, until no original material remains. The question it poses is simple in form, yet endlessly complex in implication. Is this still the same ship? The paradox rests in the quiet space between change and constancy, asking whether identity depends on material components, or whether it lies elsewhere, in form, function, history, or something less tangible. When each physical part has been exchanged for another, does the vessel that remains still deserve its original name? And if not, when exactly did it cease to be what it was? At first, one might argue that the ship remains the same. Its name has not changed. It continues to float in the harbour, serves the same purpose, and is recognized by all as the ship of Theseus. It retains its structure, its role, and its legacy. Surely it is still that ship. Yet, a shadow falls across that assumption. If identity is rooted in physical matter, how can something composed entirely of new material be said to be the same? Each plank, each nail, each rope, if all have been swapped out, What remains that ties this ship to its mythic origin? The paradox deepens when we imagine that all of the original parts, every beam and board removed from the ship, are stored carefully in a warehouse. Years later, these old parts are reassembled into a functioning ship. Now we face a bewildering duality. Two ships float before us, one maintained through replacement, the other resurrected through reassembly. Which, if either, is the true ship of Theseus? The question strikes at the heart of what we mean by identity. If identity resides in physical components, the reassembled ship would seem to have the stronger claim. But if identity is preserved through continuity, through function, recognition, or role, then perhaps the maintained ship holds the essence. This is the central dilemma of gradual change. The ship of Theseus paradox illustrates how small, incremental transformations can lead to profound shifts, yet remain invisible in the moment. When does change accumulate enough to become transformation? If we cannot identify the precise moment the ship became something else, does that mean it never truly changed? Or that our concept of identity is simply too crude to capture its evolution? Philosophers have offered various responses. Some appeal to physical continuity, the idea that identity resides in an unbroken chain of physical existence. But in the ship of Theseus, this chain is broken, repeatedly and in total. Others advocate for conceptual continuity, arguing that what matters is the ship's role in culture and memory. It is the idea of the ship that survives, not its material form. This view is compelling. It mirrors how we treat institutions, traditions, and even people. A government may change officials, laws, and buildings, yet retain its name and identity. A person grows, ages, loses cells, and gains new ones, yet we say they remain the same individual. Perhaps identity then is not in the atoms, but in the narrative, the story that binds past to present. In this sense, the ship of Theseus becomes a metaphor not only for objects, but for selves. Just as the ship is restored part by part, so too are we altered through time. Memories fade, bodies transform, beliefs shift. Are we the same person we were 10 years ago? 20? What anchors us through the flux? Biology offers a parallel. The human body regenerates its cells over time, so much so that many of the cells in your body today did not exist 7 years ago. Yet we say you remain you. Is that because of continuity of consciousness? Because your mind carries the thread of self-awareness across the changing sea of physical existence? Perhaps the identity of the ship, like that of a person, lies in its function and purpose. The ship was built to sail, to carry Theseus, to be remembered. That purpose endures, even as its parts do not. Purpose, then, might serve as a kind of metaphysical glue, binding a changing form to a stable idea. But this raises a deeper question. If identity lies in purpose or function, could any ship designed like the ship of Theseus claim to be it? If an identical replica is built with entirely new materials, no continuity, no original parts, is it also the ship of Theseus? If the answer is yes, identity becomes dangerously fluid. If no, then where do we draw the line between copy and continuation? The paradox stretches beyond philosophy into law, art, and ethics. In heritage conservation, for instance, curators debate how much restoration an object can undergo before it loses its authenticity. A sculpture with replaced limbs, is it still the original? A cathedral rebuilt after centuries of weather and war, is it still sacred? In law, the question of corporate identity emerges. A company may change owners, restructure, relocate, and reinvent its business. but as long as it retains its registration and name, it may continue to operate under the law as the same entity. Legal identity, like that of the ship, may be more conceptual than corporeal. And in digital culture, the paradox finds new form. Consider a digital file, a photograph, or a piece of music. It may be copied endlessly, stored on different servers, accessed from various devices. Which copy is the original? Does originality even matter in a realm where duplication is perfect? In this light, the ship of Theseus becomes a touchstone for our age, a reminder that the tension between change and continuity is not just academic. It shapes how we think about everything from our institutions to our identities, from the objects we preserve to the relationships we nurture. It reminds us that identity is not merely found in static matter, but in motion, function, and recognition. That the stories we tell about continuity may be more important than the physical components that underlie them. That to remain the same may, paradoxically, require constant change, reassembly, continuity, and personal identity. Let us return to the shipyard, where the second vessel now rises, rebuilt from the discarded bones of the original. Each board bears the stains of weather, the marks of use, the quiet testimony of history. These are not replacements. These are the actual parts once known as the ship of Theseus. And now they are whole again. This reassembly poses a profound challenge. If the restored ship is built from the very material of the original, doesn't it have the stronger claim to identity? And yet, the ship that sailed on through the years, constantly maintained, its purpose unbroken, continues to be recognized as Theseus's ship. Which vessel deserves the name? Which holds the essence? Here, the paradox of numerical identity versus qualitative identity takes center stage. Numerical identity demands that something be strictly identical, one and the same thing. But qualitative identity acknowledges that two things can be exactly alike in form or function, yet still be distinct. Two coins minted together, indistinguishable in appearance, are not the same coin. Applying this to the ship of Theseus, we might argue that the restored ship is numerically identical, having retained the same material. The maintained ship, meanwhile, is qualitatively identical, preserving function, form, and continuity. The paradox exposes how these two notions can come into tension, each demanding the status of authenticity, yet perhaps neither alone is sufficient. The true identity of the ship may lie not only in what it is made of, nor in how it functions, but in how it is understood by people, by culture, by memory. This introduces the idea of relational identity, that something's identity is shaped by its relationship to those who recognize and interact with it. If the citizens of Athens continue to regard the maintained ship as the vessel of Theseus, tell stories about it, honor it in rituals, use it in celebrations, then in a social and cultural sense, that ship is the ship of Theseus. Meanwhile, the reassembled ship, though materially authentic, may lack that continuity of presence in the public mind. This tension mirrors countless debates in heritage conservation. A cathedral restored with modern materials may be more stable and functional, but some may feel it has lost its soul. Conversely, a decayed ruin preserved as is may evoke deeper reverence because of its untouched link to the past. In either case, identity becomes a negotiation between material fact and collective interpretation. The ship of Theseus also speaks to personal identity, particularly in a world of rapid transformation. Consider the human body, not just the turnover of cells, but surgeries, prosthetics, transplants. At what point does a person, rebuilt and repaired, become someone new? What about identity through memory? Suppose a person slowly loses their memories to illness. Do they remain the same self? If memory is replaced, gradually or suddenly, what continuity remains? Just as the ship persists through part swapping, might a person's identity survive radical internal change? Philosophers like John Locke argued that personal identity is rooted in memory continuity, that the self is preserved through the ability to remember past experiences. But this leads to puzzles. If you forget who you were, are you still that person? If your experiences are altered by trauma, technology, or time, do you become someone else? This is not idle speculation. In the age of artificial intelligence and neural augmentation, we inch closer to realities where minds can be extended, modified, or duplicated. If a copy of your mind were uploaded to a machine and continued thinking as you, would that be you? Or would that digital consciousness be the ship of Theseus, faithfully reconstructed, but no longer the original? We are already ship of Theseus beings. From infancy to old age, our bodies and minds transform. And yet, we carry a thread of selfhood, fragile, shifting, but persistent. We insist that we remain the same person, despite decades of change. But what makes that claim legitimate? Perhaps it is the story we tell ourselves. Like the ship maintained through the years, our identity is built from a narrative, a continuous unfolding of I across time. That story is not static. It allows for growth, contradiction, repair, but it also requires a sense of continuity. Without that, we become strangers to ourselves. Here again, the ship of Theseus reveals itself not as a puzzle to solve, but a lens through which to view the world. It teaches us that identity is not fixed in material, nor anchored in a single moment. It is emergent, built through time, memory, relationship, and recognition. The paradox extends to legal and societal identity as well. Consider institutions that persist through revolution, reform, or complete restructuring. A monarchy becomes a republic, but continues the functions of the state. A company changes leadership, mission, and workforce, yet retains its brand and contracts. What remains unchanged? The legal fiction of continuity, an agreed-upon narrative that binds past to present. This is perhaps the most profound insight, that identity is a construct, often sustained by consensus. The ship of Theseus exists because people agree that it does, and this agreement persists even when the materials change. It is a shared fiction, reinforced through ritual, memory, and meaning. This doesn't diminish the ship's reality, it enriches it. It shows that identity is not a single truth, but a layered phenomenon. Material, function, continuity, recognition, all must align, or at least harmonize, for identity to hold. And when they do not align, when the reassembled ship appears beside the maintained one, the paradox becomes a choice. Which do we value more? The origin or the journey? The parts or the purpose? Some might say both ships are the ship of Theseus, each in its own way. One holds the past, the other carries the present forward. Perhaps identity, like light, behaves as both particle and the wave, defined not by essence alone, but by how it is observed and understood. In art, we see this duality often. A restored painting may look pristine, but some viewers long for the faded original. A re-recorded symphony captures every note perfectly, yet misses the nuance of the first performance. Authenticity, like identity, resists easy definition. The paradox even extends to cultural identity. Communities evolve, traditions adapt, languages shift. What does it mean to preserve a culture when its expressions change? At what point does adaptation become loss? The ship of Theseus invites us to view these transitions not as betrayals of identity, but as its natural expressions. Just as a living ship must be repaired to survive the sea, so too must identities evolve to endure time. In the end, the paradox does not demand a verdict. It offers a meditation. It reminds us that identity is not a thing to be found, but a balance to be held, a tension between what was and what is. It whispers that change is not the enemy of continuity, but its condition. And so, the ship of Theseus sails on, not in one harbour, but in many minds. It is both the ship rebuilt from old parts and the one maintained through new. It is the object, the story, the symbol. It is what we remember, what we restore, and what we recognize. The paradox and Zeno's philosophical challenge. Imagine standing at the starting line of a race. The finish line beckons in the distance, a clear and finite goal. But before you can reach it, you must first get halfway there. And then, from that midpoint, you must cover half of the remaining distance, and then half again, and again. In fact, before you can arrive at your destination, you must complete an infinite series of halfway points, each one smaller than the last, but infinite in number. This is the core of the dichotomy paradox, a thought experiment first articulated by the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea. In this paradox, motion itself seems to dissolve into impossibility. If every movement requires completing an infinite number of tasks, how can motion ever truly begin, let alone finish? At first glance, the paradox seems absurd. After all, we run, we walk, we move from place to place without hesitation. Yet, Zeno's argument is not about physical movement. It's about the logic of movement. And it's within logic that the paradox tightens its grip. To travel from point A to point B, Zeno argues, you must first reach the halfway point. But to reach that, you must reach the halfway point of that. This infinite subdivision of distance means that there are an infinite number of intervals to cross. And though each step becomes smaller, there is no final, discrete, last step to complete the journey. Therefore, the journey can never be finished, because it cannot, in fact, be started. This notion confronts the very nature of infinity, and it forces us to ask, can an infinite number of steps truly be completed in a finite amount of time? And if so, what does that say about space, time, and our understanding of reality? Zeno's paradox was not a mere intellectual exercise. It was a defense of Parmenides, his teacher, who argued that all change, including motion, is an illusion. For Parmenides, reality was singular, static, and eternal. To claim that things moved or changed was, in his view, a betrayal of reason. Zeno, ever the loyal student, crafted paradoxes to show that belief in motion led to contradictions. In the dichotomy paradox, Zeno wasn't denying that people appear to move. Instead, he was challenging the coherence of the concept of motion. If movement requires completing an infinite number of steps, and infinity cannot be traversed, then motion is not logically possible, even if it seems to occur. To visualize this, imagine slicing a single line segment in half repeatedly. First it's one segment, then two, then 4, 8, 16. Each slice cuts the remaining space in half, creating more segments, smaller and smaller. Mathematically, this can go on forever. There is no smallest piece, no final segment. If you imagine having to cross each of those segments one at a time, you may never finish. But how can something infinite be contained in something finite? That question touches on the deeper implications of Zeno's argument. He forces us to confront the paradox of infinite divisibility, the idea that space and time can be divided endlessly. If this is true, then every journey, every movement involves not just a handful of steps, but an infinity of them. And how does one ever complete an infinity? Here lies the emotional weight of the paradox. It speaks not just to the logic of motion, but to the psychology of effort. How often do we find ourselves staring at a goal that seems infinitely far away, broken into so many small, uncertain steps that the journey feels impossible? The dichotomy paradox becomes a metaphor for human struggle. Each task completed reveals another, smaller one behind it. Progress feels endless, even hopeless. Zeno's paradox resonates in part because it reflects the fear of never arriving. Whether it's in personal development, creative work, or existential purpose, we often feel caught in an infinite regress, never quite done, never fully there. Each achievement opens the door to a new task, a new halfway point yet to cross. And yet, we do move. We do arrive. The runners finish the race. The walkers reach the door. So where is the flaw in Zeno's logic? That is the central tension. The paradox presents a logical impasse at odds with lived experience. It shows us that our intuitions about space, time, and motion may not align with the abstract rules we use to describe them. In this, Zeno prefigures a central concern of philosophy, the gap between appearance and reality. Things may appear one way, but reason may lead us to a different, unsettling conclusion. The world seems fluid, but logic, under certain assumptions, can freeze it in place. This tension has haunted thinkers for centuries. For many, Zeno's paradoxes were puzzles to be solved. For others, they were clues pointing toward deeper truths about the limits of rational understanding. In some traditions, the paradox is not merely a problem to be eliminated, but a reflection of mystery, an insight into the limits of thought itself. Eastern philosophies, for instance, often embrace paradox as a way of pointing beyond the intellect. To realize that motion both is and is not possible may be to glimpse something about the unity of contradiction, a reality too vast for binary logic. Indeed, Zeno's paradox invites us into that space between the finite and the infinite, where our understanding is tested. It reminds us that language and logic, though powerful, are tools that may not always capture the full shape of experience. So in this first half of the dichotomy paradox, we see the power of ancient thought. With just a few lines of reasoning, Zeno calls into question the fundamental assumptions of movement, time, and being. He shows that beneath the surface of everyday actions lies a complex and often contradictory structure, one that challenges our most basic intuitions, modern resolutions and broader implications. To resolve Zeno's paradox is not to dismiss its brilliance, but to honor it with deeper tools Zeno himself could never have imagined. For centuries after he posed his challenges, philosophers and mathematicians wrestled with the apparent impossibility of motion. Then came a revolution, the development of calculus. In the 17th century, Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz independently developed calculus, a mathematical framework capable of addressing infinitesimally small changes. With it came the concept of a limit, a way to handle infinite processes within finite bounds. Using limits, one can show that the infinite series Zeno describes, a sum of halves, quarters, eighths, and so on, does not diverge into infinity, but instead converges to a finite number. Take the classic infinite series, 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 plus 1/16 plus. Mathematically, this infinite sum approaches 1. Each term becomes smaller and smaller so rapidly that their total despite being infinite in number, remains bounded. And this is the key to understanding motion through the lens of modern mathematics. Infinite subdivisions do not prevent arrival, because their combined distance is finite. Through this lens, Zeno's paradox dissolves, not because it is flawed, but because it lacked the language of modern analysis. Motion is possible, not because infinity is denied, but because infinity can be tamed through mathematics. What once seemed an insurmountable series of tasks is revealed to be manageable under the right conceptual framework. This reconciliation between motion and logic did not render Zeno irrelevant. Quite the opposite. It revealed how vital his thinking was. His paradox forced mathematicians to create new systems, new language, and new perspectives to accommodate the contradictions he uncovered. In this way, Zeno's challenge was not a dead end, but a doorway. Beyond mathematics, the paradox has profound implications in physics. In the study of space and time, particularly under Einstein's theories of relativity, we find further echoes of Zeno's insights. Relativity reveals that time is not an absolute backdrop against which all events unfold, but a flexible dimension shaped by speed and gravity. Space, too, bends and stretches. In such a world, our intuitions about motion, so central to Zeno's argument, must be constantly re-evaluated. Furthermore, in quantum mechanics, the idea of dividing space or time infinitely becomes less clear. At the smallest scales, the Planck length and Planck time, space and time may not be infinitely divisible. There may be fundamental units, below which the very notion of distance or duration loses meaning. In this way, modern physics suggests that Zeno's infinite regress may not apply to the deepest layers of reality, because infinity itself might not exist there. This shift from philosophical abstraction to scientific precision shows how Zeno's ancient thought experiment continues to shape our modern worldview. But its reach extends even further, into the terrain of the mind and the metaphors we use to navigate daily life. Think, for example, of personal goals. The journey to self-improvement or healing or artistic mastery often feels endless. Each milestone reveals another. Each success exposes a new challenge. Like Zeno's traveler, we feel as though we are always halving the distance, but never arriving. Here, the paradox becomes a symbol of psychological exhaustion. It reminds us that while tasks may be infinite in structure, our experience of them is finite and real. We do finish books. We do mend relationships. We do evolve. The steps may feel endless, but their cumulative power delivers us to transformation. In this way, the dichotomy paradox mirrors the inner landscape of effort. It offers not just a mathematical riddle, but a model of perseverance. It teaches that progress may feel asymptotic, forever nearing but never quite reaching, but that in truth, arrival is possible. And often, the illusion of infinity is born not from reality, but from fear. Education, too, finds resonance with Zeno's insight. Learning is an incremental process. Each concept learned opens up others. The horizon of understanding expands, revealing new gaps. Yet, over time, students do grow. Mastery accumulates. What begins as a journey of 1,000 steps becomes, with effort, a completed path. Even creativity echoes this paradox. A painter never paints the perfect stroke. A writer never finds the perfect sentence. There is always more to refine, another draft to begin. Yet paintings are completed. Books are written. The key is in recognizing that completion is not the absence of further improvement, but the arrival at enough. And so, Zeno's ancient footsteps echo through the halls of every discipline. They remind us that infinity, far from being an obstacle, is a condition of depth. It is not a wall, but a mirror, showing us how much lies hidden in the things we think we understand. In philosophy, the dichotomy paradox remains a profound challenge to the limits of logic and intuition. It calls into question the assumption that what is logically complex must be practically impossible. It forces us to recognize that conceptual clarity is not always aligned with experiential truth. In spirituality, too, the paradox becomes a parable. Many religious and contemplative traditions describe the path to enlightenment or transcendence as infinite, an endless unfolding. Yet, they also speak of moments of grace, of sudden arrival. The contradiction is embraced, not rejected. The journey is infinite, but the destination is now. In art and poetry, the paradox becomes a symbol, a song that loops without end, a painting that suggests infinity in its depth, a poem that circles back to its beginning. These works do not solve the paradox. They live in it. They echo its shape and remind us that beauty often lies in irresolution. Finally, in ethics and morality, Zeno's insight reminds us of the danger of procrastination. If one waits until every condition is perfect, one may never act. There will always be another half step to take, another doubt to resolve. But movement, ethical, moral, human, requires that we act despite the infinite regress of hesitation. To live is to move, and to move is to defy the illusion of paralysis. In the end, the dichotomy paradox is not a contradiction to be discarded, but a wisdom to be integrated. It reveals that beneath the surface of action lies a dance between infinity and finitude, between calculation and courage. It tells us that while the mind may split the path into infinite tasks, the body moves forward, the heart commits, the soul dares. So we walk not because every step is finished, but because every step matters. We run not because the journey is simple, but because it is possible. And with each breath, each decision, each leap, however small, we cross the infinite and arrive. The logical setup and self-reference crisis. In a quiet village, tucked away from the clamor of the world, a peculiar rule governs grooming. There is one barber in town, and he shaves all the men who do not shave themselves, and only those men. It is a straightforward decree, or so it seems. But within this rule lies a question that spirals into paradox. Does the barber shave himself? If the barber shaves himself, then by definition, he does not shave himself, since he only shaves those who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, then he must shave himself, because he shaves all men who don't shave themselves. Either way, the logic devours itself. The rule folds inward, and the question leads to a contradiction. This is the barber paradox, a modern restatement of Russell's paradox, and one of the most illuminating examples of how self-reference can rupture logical systems. On the surface, the paradox seems whimsical, almost like a riddle, but it carries within it the seeds of a profound crisis, one that would shake the foundations of mathematics, logic, and philosophy in the early 20th century. The structure of the paradox is disarmingly simple. We begin with a set of men in a village. Each man either shaves himself or is shaved by the barber, but not both. The barber is defined as the man who shaves all those, and only those, who do not shave themselves. When we then ask whether the barber shaves himself, we realize that the definition excludes the possibility of either answer being logically consistent. If he does, he must not. If he doesn't, he must. The brilliance of this paradox lies in its self-referential design. It establishes a rule that refers back to the subject governed by the rule. The result is an infinite feedback loop, a logical structure that collapses under the weight of its own definitions. It's akin to the statement, "This sentence is false." It breaks the very framework within which we expect language and logic to function. But the Barber paradox is not just a curiosity. It is a simplified version of a discovery that would rock the foundations of mathematics. In 1901, Bertrand Russell uncovered a problem in naive set theory, the assumption that any coherent condition can be used to define a set. Russell considered the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. If such a set exists, then asking whether it contains itself leads to a contradiction, just as the question of the barber shaving himself does. Russell's paradox revealed that some self-referential definitions could not be allowed in formal systems if consistency was to be preserved. The paradox called into question the very foundation of set theory, which had been seen as a pristine basis for all of mathematics. It exposed a crack in the logical architecture upon which the rest of the mathematical world was built. The response from the mathematical community was swift and serious. In order to protect logic from this kind of paradox, theorists developed stricter rules for defining sets. One of the key outcomes was the type theory proposed by Russell himself, which introduced a hierarchy to prevent sets from referring to themselves. In type theory, a set can only contain elements of a lower type. It cannot contain itself or any set of the same or higher type. This was a formal attempt to banish self-reference from foundational mathematics. Later developments, such as Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, ZF, with the axiom of regularity, also worked to ensure that no set could be a member of itself. These axioms introduced a more rigorous framework for constructing sets, thus avoiding paradoxes like that of the barber. In these systems, the very possibility of a barber who shaves exactly those who do not shave themselves would be invalid. It would be ruled out by the foundational axioms. But even as mathematics attempted to seal the breach, the paradox persisted in other realms, as a philosophical metaphor, as a logical challenge, and as a warning about the dangers of unchecked recursion. It reminds us that even the most careful structures of thought can collapse under the strain of self-reference. It urges humility in the face of logic's limits. In a broader sense, the Barber paradox illuminates the tension between universal rules and self-inclusion. Any rule that applies to a group must account for whether it applies to the rule-maker as well. This problem arises not only in logic, but in ethics, governance, and epistemology. Can a law apply to the lawmaker? Can a moral principle bind the one who declares it? Can a system analyze itself without contradiction? These questions reflect the same core problem. When a system turns its gaze inward, the clarity of external logic may blur. The barber, like the set of all sets, becomes a mirror that cannot reflect itself without shattering the image. And yet, paradox has its place, not only as a sign of error, but as a guidepost toward greater understanding. The Barber paradox, though it breaks naive assumptions, also points toward deeper clarity. It shows where the rules must be refined. It draws a boundary between what seems coherent and what truly is. It reveals the hidden structure of logic by showing us what happens when that structure is pushed too far. In this way, the paradox becomes not a failure, but a tool of insight. It reveals not just the limits of a specific idea, but the need for meta-rules, rules about rules, frameworks that govern how we build other frameworks. Russell's insight was not merely that some definitions are dangerous, but that we must think about how we define, and who gets to define in the first place. And so, From a quaint village rule about shaving, we are led to the pillars of logic and mathematics. We discover that even the simplest assumptions must be carefully examined. We learn that self-reference, while often powerful, must be handled with precision and care. Implications in mathematics, philosophy, and computation. To grasp the full significance of the Barber paradox, one must go beyond its logical structure and explore its echoes in other domains: mathematics, philosophy, computation, and the lived experience of self-reference. For this paradox, like a stone dropped into a still pond, creates ripples far wider than its origin might suggest. At its core, the paradox unveils the danger of unrestricted comprehension, the assumption that for any property or rule, there exists a well-defined set of things that satisfy it. This assumption, so intuitive in ordinary thought, breaks down when applied without constraint to systems that include themselves. The set of all sets that do not contain themselves is not just ill-defined, it is impossible within naive logic. In formal mathematics, this realization led to a deep re-evaluation of foundations. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a surge of optimism about formalizing all of mathematics on a solid logical base. Set theory was to be the cornerstone, simple, elegant, and complete. But Russell's discovery, and its allegorical version, the Barber paradox, shattered that vision. The result was a revolution in mathematical logic. The Zermelo-Fraenkel ZF axioms, and later the ZFC system ZF plus the axiom of choice, carefully reconstructed set theory without allowing the kinds of unrestricted definitions that birthed Russell's paradox. These systems restricted how sets could be formed, using rules that made sure each set was well-founded, built up from simpler sets, never self-referential. But even within these safer frameworks, the ghost of paradox lingered. The very act of excluding certain constructions reminded mathematicians that their systems were not invincible. They could be built stronger, but they were not beyond error. And indeed, Kurt Gödel would later prove that any consistent formal system powerful enough to describe arithmetic cannot prove its own consistency. This, too, was a kind of self-reference, and it pointed back in spirit to the contradiction that first emerged from a simple Barber's dilemma. In this way, the Barber paradox not only shaped mathematics, it led to some of the most profound discoveries about its limits. It showed that logic must be treated not as an absolute, but as a structure subject to constraints and context. In philosophy, the paradox invites deeper reflections on the nature of rules, identity, and autonomy. When a rule governs a group and then turns back to include the rule maker, we face a collapse. This has analogies in epistemology, where the question arises, can a system of knowledge account for its own assumptions? Can a belief justify itself, or must it appeal to something external? This becomes even more pressing in ethics. If one proposes a moral rule, say, all people must be held accountable, does that apply to the proposer as well? And what happens if the rule breaker is also the rule maker? The Barber paradox becomes a metaphor for power and self-regulation, for the complexity of holding oneself to the same standards one imposes on others. In the domain of language and semantics, the paradox aligns with the liar's paradox, where a sentence refers to itself in a way that generates contradiction. Philosophers like Alfred Tarski responded by creating hierarchies of language, a meta-language above the base language, and so on, to avoid the paradox of self-reference. These strategies mirrored what Russell and others did in mathematics: divide the levels of abstraction so that no entity can refer directly to itself. The Barber paradox thus becomes a symbol of intellectual humility, It reminds us that the rules we create, the structures we rely on, must be carefully delineated. Systems need boundaries. Definitions require discipline. Not everything that seems coherent can survive the scrutiny of self-inclusion. Nowhere is this more evident than in computer science, where the dangers of self-reference are not just conceptual, they are operational. In programming, recursive functions that call themselves, must be carefully bounded. Without clear stopping conditions, a recursive function falls into infinite regression, consuming memory, freezing systems, and crashing machines. The Barber paradox is, in essence, a blueprint for such a crash, a rule that cannot resolve itself, a logic that eats itself. In artificial intelligence and formal logic systems, paradoxes like this must be explicitly handled. Logical agents, semantic analyzers, and AI models must be protected from inputs that lead to undecidable loops. Just as mathematical set theory evolved to exclude paradoxical constructs, so too must computational frameworks include error handling, type systems, and verification tools to avoid logical breakdowns. The paradox also finds a curious echo in self-replicating code, programs that produce copies of themselves or modify themselves during execution. These programs tread a delicate path, where self-reference must be allowed but controlled. Just as the barber's dilemma arises from self-application of a rule, so too can certain lines of code lead to unexpected or paradoxical outcomes when they attempt to act upon themselves. From this perspective, the Barber paradox becomes a lens through which to view the limits of autonomy. It asks, what happens when an agent governs itself with the same logic it uses to govern others? The answer, often, is instability. And so, in designing systems, logical, computational, ethical, we must account for metastructure. We must step outside the system to make the rules that shape it. This insight extends even into psychology and personal identity. The mind reflects upon itself, judges itself, analyzes itself, commands itself. But can it do so coherently? The Barber paradox offers a metaphor for the internal conflicts we all face. When we try to apply rules to ourselves that were meant for others, when we seek objectivity within the subjective. Therapists and philosophers alike observe this self-referential trap. The person who demands perfection from themselves but not from others, who forgives others but not their own failings. The inner barber becomes a source of tension, a voice that both applies and violates its own laws. In this way, the paradox is not just logical, but deeply human. And perhaps that is its most lasting legacy. The Barber paradox, though born in abstraction, speaks to the fragility of all systems, human, computational, institutional, that lack a clear boundary between rule and ruler, definition and definer. It reveals the tension between authority and inclusion, between identity and autonomy. We find its echoes in political theory. Can a governing body govern itself? In jurisprudence, can a judge rule on their own case? In theology, can a creator be subject to its own creation? Each of these is a variation on the theme, a complex restatement of the barber's impossible question. And in each case, we see the need for structure, hierarchy, and meta-perspective. We learn that a healthy system must not only operate, but also understand the conditions of its own operation. In the end, the Barber paradox is not a flaw. It is a feature of systems that dare to look inward. It is the mirror that logic holds to itself, the edge where structure meets self-awareness. And in that edge lies both danger and discovery, because to think clearly is not only to build coherent rules, but to know when and how they apply. To live wisely is not only to follow principles, but to recognize when principles fold back on themselves. And to avoid the fate of the barber, we must sometimes step outside the mirror, not to escape reflection, but to see it whole. Abundance, freedom, and decision fatigue. We live in an age of abundance. Supermarkets offer 30 kinds of bread. Streaming services hold thousands of films. Online retailers promise limitless options, delivered to your door in a day. At every turn, modern life dazzles with variety. And in this ocean of possibility, a strange, invisible weight presses down. This is the paradox of choice. The idea that more options, far from liberating us, may in fact paralyze and diminish our well-being. At the heart of this paradox lies a contradiction. Choice is supposed to enhance freedom, and freedom is the cornerstone of happiness. But when choices become too numerous, they can produce confusion, regret, anxiety, and self-doubt. The very mechanism meant to empower us can become a source of suffering. The concept was popularized by psychologist Barry Schwartz, who argued that while some choice is undoubtedly better than none, more is not always better than less. His research revealed that when people are presented with too many options, they tend to feel less satisfied with their decisions, regardless of the outcome. Consider a simple example: buying jam. In a famous experiment, consumers were offered a selection of 6 jams or 24 jams. While more people were drawn to the larger display, they were less likely to make a purchase. Those faced with fewer options were more decisive and reported greater satisfaction with their choice. More variety intrigued the eye, but froze the hand. This phenomenon, known as choice overload, affects more than shopping. It seeps into every arena of modern decision-making, from career paths to relationships, from vacation planning to online dating. We are constantly choosing, scrolling, comparing, and in doing so, hesitating. The mind grows weary. The will falters. Why does this happen? One reason is cognitive load. Each option carries attributes to evaluate: cost, quality, aesthetics, function, implications. As the number of options grows, so too does the mental effort required to process them. Our brains, brilliant though they are, were not evolved for this level of abundance. They tire, they stall. Another reason is the fear of regret. With every choice made, a multitude of alternatives are left behind. In choosing one path, we relinquish all others. This loss, real or imagined, generates anxiety. What if the other option was better? Becomes a question that haunts the decision. The more options we face, the more imagined, better paths we must sacrifice. Moreover, greater choice raises the standard for success. With only 2 or 3 options, satisfaction is easier to achieve. With 50, a choice must be exceptional to feel acceptable. The bar rises with the abundance. This phenomenon is known as the escalation of expectations. As the range of possibilities expands, so too does the imagined ideal. Reality struggles to compete with the fantasy of perfection. And when satisfaction fails to materialize, we blame ourselves. In a limited choice environment, it's easier to accept that circumstances were suboptimal. But in a world of limitless options, dissatisfaction feels like personal failure. I had so many choices. Why didn't I choose better? This self-blame is corrosive. It turns the liberating act of choosing into a source of guilt. Some people respond by becoming maximizers, those who seek the best possible choice in every situation. They research exhaustively, compare endlessly, and often delay decisions in pursuit of the ideal. Others become satisficers, who settle for good enough, and often report greater happiness. Maximizers may get better results on paper, but they experience less joy. The weight of possibility saps their peace. In this way, the paradox of choice is not merely about abundance. It is about the psychology of responsibility. Each decision feels more consequential when more options are available. Each outcome feels more personal. The burden of optimality looms large, and the soul feels it. We often imagine that more choice equates to more control. But as options multiply, control may give way to confusion. Decision fatigue sets in. We delay, we defer, we disengage. In the worst cases, we opt out entirely, choosing nothing rather than facing the fear of choosing poorly. And so, abundance becomes a trap. Yet, this is not a call to return to deprivation. Few would argue that fewer choices always lead to better lives. Rather, the paradox of choice teaches us that there is a threshold, a place beyond which more becomes less. It invites us to curate our environments, to embrace simplicity, and to place limits where necessary. In doing so, we may rediscover the value of clarity, the relief of commitment, and the quiet joy of enough. Psychological burden and philosophical reflections. The paradox of choice, while rooted in behavioral psychology, extends into the deeper soil of philosophy, where the burden of freedom has long been examined. In the existentialist tradition, freedom is not merely a privilege, it is a profound responsibility. To choose is to define oneself. To decide is to carve identity from the raw material of possibility. Yet, with this power comes angst. As Jean-Paul Sartre noted, we are condemned to be free. We must choose, and in choosing, we cannot escape the weight of consequence. Modern life, with its sprawling options and global access, amplifies this burden. What was once a quiet philosophical dilemma is now a daily psychological event. In earlier ages, life paths were narrower. One might inherit a profession, remain in a hometown, marry within a familiar circle. These constraints, while limiting, also reduced existential strain. One's choices were not absolute, and therefore not crushing. Today, the proliferation of paths forces each individual to become their own navigator, judge, and architect. This leads to a condition we might call freedom fatigue, where the abundance of choice itself becomes a kind of tyranny. We begin to long, paradoxically, for constraint, for guidance, for the peace of limits, a set menu, a closed door, a life simplified. This desire is not weakness. It is a recognition that meaning emerges through limitation. A blank canvas may hold infinite potential, but a single brushstroke begins the story. Without that first mark, all potential is paralyzing. Likewise, a life filled with infinite options may inspire awe, but it may also lead to stasis, confusion, and regret. And so, the paradox of choice reveals a deeper truth, that freedom requires structure, that meaningful living is not about having every option, but about choosing well within a curated field. It is the narrowing, not the expansion, that allows the self to emerge with clarity. There is also a moral dimension to this paradox. In a world saturated with options, we may fall into the trap of believing that others, too, are wholly responsible for their outcomes. They had choices, we might say, ignoring the complex factors that govern access, background, and mental bandwidth. The paradox of choice warns us against this illusion of absolute agency. More options do not mean equal power to choose wisely. In this way, the paradox becomes a critique of modern meritocracy. If success is seen as the result of superior choice-making, then failure is deemed a personal flaw. But the truth is more nuanced. Some are paralyzed not by laziness, but by excess. Others drown in the very abundance meant to uplift them. We must therefore approach choice not only as individuals, but as a society, designing systems that support decision-making, reduce noise, and respect the limits of human cognition. Philosophically, the paradox of choice invites us to examine the values beneath our desire for freedom. Do we seek choice for its own sake, or for what it enables? Does freedom mean more, or does it mean better? In pursuing maximal liberty, do we sometimes forget the purpose of liberation? A life lived with presence, depth, and coherence. These questions call us to shift our perspective, from the quantity of options to the quality of engagement. They ask us to rethink the design of our lives, our institutions, and our technologies. Algorithms that offer endless scrolls may seem generous, but they often obscure satisfaction. More is not always more. We begin to understand that choice is not an end, but a means, and it is most meaningful when guided by values, purpose, and clarity. When choice is shaped by intention, not impulse, it becomes empowering rather than overwhelming. In practice, this may mean limiting options in small but significant ways, choosing fewer clothes but ones that matter, fewer apps but ones that serve, fewer goals but ones pursued deeply. This is not asceticism, it is precision, a commitment to shaping freedom into form. It may also mean embracing ritual and habit, which transform recurring choices into intentional rhythms. Instead of agonizing over every decision, we embed our values into routines. In doing so, we free the mind from clutter and the heart from the strain of constant deliberation. And perhaps, above all, the paradox of choice calls us to accept imperfection, to release the fantasy of the perfect decision, to recognize that satisfaction comes not from choosing flawlessly, but from choosing and then committing with grace. This is the quiet wisdom of enough. In the end, choice is not about mastering the world, but about finding one's place within it. Not about having everything, but about cherishing something. Not about infinite possibility, but about the singular beauty of the path taken. The paradox of choice does not demand that we abandon freedom. It invites us to redefine it as something sculpted, purposeful, and human. Bootstrap Paradox, Part 1, Causality Loops and the Question of Origin. Timestamp range 1:1646 to 1:2228. Target word count 1,143 words. Imagine a time traveler who journeys into the past with a copy of Shakespeare's Hamlet in hand. He hands it to a young Shakespeare, who then publishes it as his own. Generations later, a scholar finds the book, and it eventually falls into the hands of the time traveler, who takes it back in time to give to Shakespeare. The question emerges like a ripple in time. Who wrote Hamlet? This is the essence of the bootstrap paradox, also known as the ontological paradox, a temporal anomaly in which an object, piece of information, or person exists in a closed loop of time, with no discernible point of origin. It is bootstrapped into existence, seemingly out of nowhere, defying the principle of causality. The name bootstrap comes from the absurd image of a person lifting themselves into the air by pulling up on their own bootstraps. In this paradox, an object or event becomes self-originating. It causes itself, creating a logical circle that challenges our most basic understanding of time, cause, and effect. At first glance, the paradox seems like a clever plot device, fodder for science fiction and philosophical musing. But it represents a genuine dilemma in the metaphysics of time travel. It forces us to ask, can something exist without ever being created? Can the timeline support a loop in which the origin is the future rather than the past? The bootstrap paradox is especially troubling because it violates the fundamental principle of causality. The idea that every effect must have a cause. In classical physics and common sense, causes precede effects. But in a causal loop, this sequence is scrambled. An effect becomes its own cause. The result is a closed loop of existence that appears coherent on the surface, but collapses under scrutiny. One of the most famous thought experiments involving this paradox is the time traveler who gives himself the blueprints for a time machine. He builds the machine using those blueprints and later travels back to give them to his younger self. Again, the question arises, who invented the time machine? The blueprints seem to have no point of creation. They exist because they always have. Yet this always is an illusion sustained by a loop. In such loops, the object or knowledge is said to be self-existent, but this self-existence lacks explanatory power. It avoids the question of origin by cycling endlessly. Philosophers and physicists alike have debated whether such loops are logically possible, or whether they are violations of the coherence of reality. From a deterministic perspective, one might argue that if the timeline allows for such a loop, then everything within it is self-consistent. This view aligns with the Novikov self-consistency principle, which posits that any actions taken by a time traveler were always part of history, and therefore paradoxes are impossible. Under this lens, the time traveler giving the book to Shakespeare was always meant to happen, and thus the book's lack of origin is not a contradiction, but a feature of a self-consistent timeline. But others are not so easily convinced. For many, the paradox reveals a kind of metaphysical incoherence. It suggests the presence of an event without genesis, a loop that evades the flow of time. This strains our understanding of reality, where things begin, develop, and end, not endlessly circle without foundation. The bootstrap paradox also poses challenges to the ontology of information. If knowledge can exist without creation, if it simply is, then what does that say about learning, authorship, and invention? The Shakespeare example is especially haunting. Hamlet is not created by Shakespeare, nor by the time traveler, but by the loop. The genius of the work belongs to no one and to everyone. In this way, the paradox becomes a meditation on authorship and originality. In a world of closed causal loops, nothing is new. Everything is inherited from itself. Creativity dissolves into recursion, and the human desire for origin stories, where things begin, who made them, why they came to be, is left unfulfilled. Yet the paradox also opens fascinating doors. It invites us to reconsider linear time, the notion that past, present, and future are distinct, sequential phases. In a looped timeline, this linearity is distorted. The past can depend on the future. The origin lies not behind, but ahead. This non-linear vision of time has parallels in physics. In Einstein's theory of relativity, time is not a universal constant, but a dimension, much like space. Events can be separated by time in one frame of reference, yet simultaneous or reversed in another. This flexibility lays the groundwork for the theoretical possibility of closed time-like curves, pathways through space-time that return to their starting point. In such frameworks, the bootstrap paradox is not ruled out by physics. It is strange, yes, but not impossible. The real barrier may not be nature, but interpretation. Can our minds, shaped by beginnings and endings, truly grasp a looped cause? The bootstrap paradox thus challenges us on every level. It stretches the boundaries of physics. It interrogates the structure of logic, and it unsettles the mind, which yearns for linear narratives and neat origins. It shows us that time, like thought, may bend back upon itself, creating not just puzzles, but revelations, temporal logic, identity, and metaphysical implications. To fully grasp the bootstrap paradox, we must consider not only causality and chronology, but also the intricate question of identity. In a timeline where origin dissolves, the boundaries of identity become uncertain. If a person exists because of their own actions in the future, if knowledge is passed back from one self to another, what then is the continuity of the self? Consider a scenario where a scientist receives a notebook from their older self, a record of discoveries not yet made. They read, they learn, they replicate the findings, and years later, they send the same notebook back in time to their younger self. The knowledge remains intact, but it was never discovered. The question emerges, who is the author? Is it the younger self, the older one, or the timeline itself? This recursive logic blurs not only authorship, but also personal evolution. In normal time, identity is shaped through struggle, experience, trial, and error. We grow, we learn, we fail, and through it all, we become ourselves. But in a bootstrap loop, development is short-circuited. The scientist never has to make the discoveries. They are handed to them. They become who they are because they already were. This recursive becoming threatens our intuitive sense of growth. It compresses time, erases the need for progress, and replaces learning with replication. It forces us to ask whether identity is defined by effort or simply by outcome. Are we who we are because of the paths we walk, or merely because of the facts we possess? In this way, the bootstrap paradox becomes a lens through which to examine the tension between existence and essence. If existence precedes essence, as existentialists argue, then one must first live in order to become. But the bootstrap loop flips this logic. It suggests that essence can exist without origin, without journey, merely placed into the world, complete and unearned. This has disturbing implications not only for identity, but for meaning. If objects or people exist without origin, does their existence carry the same weight? If a song, a story, or a theory has no creator, if it simply is, can it inspire in the same way? Or does it lose something vital when severed from the arc of creation? In theology and metaphysics, these questions have long been considered. What does it mean for something to be uncaused? Traditional conceptions of God, for instance, often define the divine as the uncaused cause, the origin without origin. The bootstrap paradox echoes this structure, but without the sacred dimension. It creates an uncaused cause, not imbued with intention, but with randomness or necessity. Thus, the paradox may be seen as a secular echo of divine causality, a loop where the beginning and end are the same, eternal and undefined. But unlike theological explanations, the bootstrap loop lacks transcendence. It feels mechanical, empty, even absurd. It produces existence, but not necessarily purpose. Still, one might find meaning even in the loop. Perhaps the paradox does not negate authorship, but invites us to broaden its definition. Perhaps identity is not a straight line, but a curve. Perhaps knowledge need not be discovered anew to be real. It need only be understood. The bootstrap loop then becomes not a violation of meaning, but a reimagining of it. In science fiction, these ideas play out in fascinating ways. A common trope involves the time traveler who becomes their own ancestor, who fathers or mothers the lineage that eventually leads to themselves. This form of biological bootstrap collapses genealogy into a circle. making the person both descendant and progenitor. Such tales, while speculative, offer profound metaphors for human identity. We are, in many ways, shaped by echoes, by the inheritance of culture, ideas, trauma, and hope. We bootstrap ourselves through the stories we tell, the knowledge we inherit, the identities we mirror. Perhaps the paradox is less about time travel and more about how human history itself is recursive, a loop of transmission, repetition, and reimagination. On a deeper level, the bootstrap paradox challenges our obsession with origin stories. It asks whether the beginning is always necessary, or whether certain things can simply exist, held in the flow of time like eddies in a river. It suggests that our fixation on causality might be a limitation of the human mind, not a law of nature. This resonates with Buddhist and Eastern philosophies, which often emphasize the interdependence of phenomena. In these traditions, things arise not from single causes, but from networks of conditions, a web without a center. The bootstrap loop, strange though it seems, may mirror this idea. It is not an absurdity, but a pointer to a reality beyond linear thinking. Still, the paradox retains its strangeness. It resists closure. It leaves us with a loop, but no entry point. It defies the comfort of beginnings and endings. In this, it reflects something elemental about the universe, a kind of ontological humility, that not all things can be explained, that some truths may loop infinitely, like the serpent that swallows its own tail. And perhaps this is the most important lesson the bootstrap paradox offers. It shows us the limits of explanation. It teaches that understanding is not always about tracing a line from cause to effect, but about standing in the circle, aware of the loop, and still at peace within it. So we return again to the question, who wrote Hamlet? The answer may be no one and everyone. It may be a question not of origin, but of continuity, not of creation, but of persistence. The paradox closes its loop, and we are left with the mystery. The logic of vagueness and the heap problem. A single grain of sand does not make a heap. Add another grain, and still it is not a heap. Continue this process, one grain at a time, and the question remains, at what point does it become a heap? This is the heart of the Sorite's paradox, a riddle not of numbers, but of vagueness, of the boundaries between what is and what is not. Derived from the Greek word sorites, meaning heap. This paradox was first formulated by ancient philosophers to expose the limitations of categorical thinking. The puzzle begins with a clear premise. One grain of sand is not a heap. It then adds grains incrementally, each step seemingly insignificant. But at some point, imperceptibly, the non-heap becomes a heap. The problem is, where exactly does that shift occur? The Sorite's paradox does not rely on contradiction in the classical sense. Instead, it plays with our concepts, those hazy, everyday categories like bald, tall, old, or rich. If you pluck a single hair from someone's head, they are not bald. But repeat the act, hair by hair, and eventually they are. Yet no single pluck seems to cause the transition. Like the sand, the change feels invisible, yet its cumulative effect is undeniable. This is the logic of vagueness, and it challenges our desire for precise categories in a world full of gradients. The paradox forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth. Many concepts we use to navigate daily life are inherently fuzzy. They resist sharp boundaries, even though language demands them. Consider the example of wealth. A person with a single dollar is not rich. Add $1, and they're still not rich. Add another. At what point does wealth appear? The transition is not marked by a specific threshold. It emerges gradually, quietly, and with ambiguity. Yet our language treats rich as a definitive state, as if there is a clear line where poverty ends and wealth begins. This dissonance between gradual change and binary labels is what gives the Soreite's paradox its enduring power. It shows us that logic, when applied too strictly to vague concepts, can lead to absurd or unresolvable conclusions. It exposes a fault line in reasoning, a crack where our categories fail to map the fluidity of reality. Philosophers have wrestled with this paradox for centuries, seeking ways to preserve logical consistency without denying the complexity of the world. Some have proposed epistemic theories, arguing that the problem lies not in the concepts themselves, but in our knowledge of them. According to this view, there is a cutoff point, some exact number of grains that marks the transition to a heap, but we simply cannot know where it lies. Others, however, reject this line of thought. They argue that such precision is artificial, that the very idea of an exact boundary contradicts the nature of vague terms. These thinkers propose that vagueness is ontological, not epistemic. It is not about what we know, but about what is. The world itself, they argue, contains fuzzy edges, and no amount of precision can erase them. Another response comes from supervaluationism, a theory that tries to preserve the truth value of vague statements. According to this view, a sentence like, "This is a heap," may be neither true nor false in borderline cases, but it is still meaningful. If a statement is true under all precise ways of making the term exact, it is super true. If it is false under all precisifications, it is super false. In this way, the theory tries to navigate the gray zones without collapsing into contradiction. Yet, none of these resolutions fully dissolve the paradox. The Soreite's remains, not as a flaw in thinking, but as a mirror held up to the human mind. It reveals the limitations of a system that seeks binary answers in a world that often offers none. It reflects the discomfort of ambiguity and the struggle to reconcile gradual change with categorical language. The paradox also has implications for legal reasoning, where vague terms abound: reasonable force, undue influence, substantial harm. Courts must decide when behavior crosses a line, even though the line itself is nebulous. The law demands clarity, but life offers continua. The result is a tension between the rule and the case, the ideal and the actual. In ethics, too, the Soreite's paradox leaves its mark. When does neglect become abuse? When does indulgence become harm? When does help become dependency? These questions resist absolute answers, and yet decisions must be made. Moral reasoning often lives in the spaces between, balancing values, weighing contexts, sensing the slope of change rather than its boundaries. Even in politics and identity, the paradox resonates. At what point does a movement become a revolution? When does a protest become a riot? When does a person cross the threshold from ally to opponent, from child to adult, from stranger to friend? These questions are not just theoretical. They are deeply human. The Soreite's paradox reminds us that we navigate a world where boundaries are often constructed, not discovered. It teaches humility in judgment, patience in classification, and care in language. And so, the grain of sand becomes a symbol, not just of a paradox, but of the challenge of making sense of continuity in a world that often demands division. Language, identity, and the spectrum of change. The Soreite's paradox is not only a challenge of logic, it is a profound commentary on language and the tension between the fluidity of experience and the rigidity of expression. Language strives for clarity. It names, it defines, it separates. Yet the world resists this sorting. It blurs, blends, and transitions in quiet increments. And nowhere is this tension more evident than in how we talk about identity. Consider the notion of adulthood. At what precise moment does a person cease to be a child and become an adult? Is it at the age of 18, 21, or some other arbitrary number? Or does adulthood emerge over time, through experience, through burden, through self-realization? No single birthday grants maturity, and yet the law draws hard lines, and society follows suit. This disjunction between categorical language and evolving reality lies at the heart of the Sorite's paradox. Our words imply sharp transitions, this or that, heap or not, adult or not, but the world operates along a spectrum of change. Identity is not toggled like a switch. It is grown into slowly and unevenly. The paradox also echoes in gender. When does masculinity shift into femininity, or vice versa? When does ambiguity become clarity? For many, gender is not a binary, but a continuum. Yet language, constrained by habit and structure, often demands classification. The Sorite exposes how poorly suited some linguistic categories are for reflecting lived reality. It reveals the friction between expression and existence. In mental health, too, the paradox lingers. At what point does sadness become depression? When does concern become anxiety? These transitions are rarely sudden. They happen in the small, accumulating moments. A sleepless night, a heavy morning, an invisible weight that builds. Yet diagnoses, insurance, and treatment protocols require thresholds. The human condition, however, is rarely so neat. Even in relationships, the Sorite haunts us. When does liking become love? When does friendship end? When does betrayal begin? These are not moments, but processes, slow shifts that are felt rather than marked. And yet we speak as if love begins at a certain date, as if betrayal happens in an instant. The paradox reveals how our need for narrative oversimplifies the gradients of emotion. What, then, is the alternative? If our categories fail us, must we abandon language altogether? Not necessarily, but we may need to refine our relationship with words, to treat them not as absolutes, but as tools, useful but limited, powerful but imprecise. We may need to accept that some concepts are better drawn with charcoal than with ink, with shadows and edges, rather than borders. The Sorite's paradox encourages a kind of philosophical humility. It reminds us that knowledge is often about approximation, not exactitude. That understanding may come through patterns, not points. That meaning lies not just in the endpoints, but in the trajectory. This perspective finds resonance in Eastern philosophies, where binaries are often softened into dualities, yin and yang, presence and absence, stillness and motion. In these frameworks, truth is not a matter of either or, but of balance, of gradation, of interdependent opposites. The Sorite's paradox, though born in the Western philosophical canon, finds a kind of home in these ideas, a place where the boundary dissolves and continuity is honored. In the arts, the Sorite becomes a metaphor for style and expression. When does a sketch become a painting? When does rhythm become music? When does prose become poetry? These transitions are subtle, a shift in line, in tone, in silence. Creativity often flourishes in these in-between spaces, the liminal zones where certainty fades and nuance begins. In literature, characters often undergo change so slowly, so imperceptibly, that the reader may not see it happening. Yet by the end of the story, transformation is undeniable. The Sorite's paradox lives in this slow unfolding, in the gentle arc of identity, in the quiet bend of plot. It reflects a truth about narrative structure, that change is not always a moment, but a momentum. In technology, the paradox appears in design and innovation. When does an idea become a product? When does a beta become a launch? When does a tool become obsolete? These processes are rarely binary. They evolve, adapt, shift, often in response to pressures both internal and external. Yet markets demand clarity, and so we draw lines. The paradox reminds us that these lines are often drawn on moving ground. But perhaps the most profound domain in which the Sorite's paradox unfolds is personal growth. When does a person change? When does a pattern break? When does healing begin? Change in the human soul is rarely sudden. It happens in mornings that feel different for no reason, in conversations that linger, in small decisions made without drama. The paradox reminds us that growth is not always visible, but it accumulates, like the grains of sand one by one. This is both comforting and challenging. It means that progress can be slow and still real, that setbacks do not erase change, that the journey matters, even when the destination is vague. But it also means that the lines we draw about who we are, what we've done, how far we've come, may be arbitrary. They are stories we tell, not truths we uncover. And so, the Sorite's paradox becomes more than a puzzle. It becomes a lens, a way to see the in-between, a way to honor transitions, a way to live with nuance, philosophical interpretations and the limits of precision. The Sorite's paradox does more than reveal the instability of vague predicates. It lays bare the limits of precision itself. In a world that craves certainty, it offers a humbling reminder. Some truths cannot be pinpointed. They resist exactness not because we are ignorant, but because they are, in their essence, gradual. Philosophers have tried to resolve the paradox through various technical frameworks. One such response is fuzzy logic, a mathematical system that abandons binary true-false values in favor of degrees of truth. In this system, a person may be 0.3 bald, or a pile 0.6 heap. Fuzzy logic acknowledges what ordinary logic resists. That vagueness can be quantified, even if imprecisely. This model proves useful in engineering, artificial intelligence, and control systems, where binary categories are insufficient to handle nuance. Elevators that adjust based on weight, thermostats that regulate temperature with subtle gradation, all rely on fuzzy logic. In these applications, the Sorite's paradox isn't a problem, but a design feature. Yet some argue that this numerical approach dilutes meaning. Reducing baldness to 0.7 feels more clinical than human. It may capture gradation, but not the lived experience of becoming. Numbers are precise, but the process of change is emotional, relational, and existential. Another approach is contextualism, which claims that vague terms shift meaning based on context. What counts as tall varies between a basketball team and a kindergarten class. What is rich in one society may be modest in another. According to this view, the paradox dissolves when we realize that our standards flex. The threshold changes with our frame of reference, but contextualism has its limits. While it explains variation, it doesn't fully address transition. The Sorite's paradox is not just about where the line lies. It's about the fact that any line seems arbitrary. Even within one context, change accumulates invisibly. vagueness persists. This leads to semantic nihilism, the radical idea that vague terms have no clear meaning at all. According to this view, concepts like heap or bald are so inherently unstable that they cannot ground meaningful discourse. Language, under this lens, becomes a house built on sand. And yet, we use these words. We live by them. We understand each other, not perfectly, but well enough. This suggests that meaning may not be a matter of logic alone. It may arise from shared usage, from social intuition, from pragmatic clarity. The Sorite's paradox thus becomes not just a logical dilemma, but a mirror of human cognition. It shows how we create meaning, not through rigid categories, but through consensus and flexibility. Language works not because it is precise, but because it is adaptable. This adaptability is a strength, not a flaw. It allows language to reflect the continuity of experience, to stretch across the vast and shifting gradients of reality. It lets us speak in shades, in moods, in metaphors. It lets us name things that have no edges. In this way, the paradox becomes a celebration of ambiguity. It reminds us that the richness of life lies not in clear borders, but in the twilight zones, the moments between decisions, the spaces between identities, the transitions between phases of becoming. Think of memory. When does a moment become the past? When does forgetting begin? The mind does not flip switches. It weaves and frays. Time blurs. Meaning dissolves. The Sorite's paradox echoes in the very structure of thought. In morality, too, the paradox has weight. When does complicity begin? When does silence become endorsement? When does help become harm? These are not questions with binary answers. They require judgment, reflection, awareness of nuance. The Sorite teaches us that moral clarity often requires moral complexity. In the realm of policy, vagueness is both a challenge and a necessity. Laws must be clear, yet also flexible enough to handle edge cases. Where should welfare stop? Where should punishment begin? Legislators grapple with thresholds that are by nature approximate. The Sorite reminds them, and us, that governance is not the enforcement of precision, but the balancing of principles in a world of gradients. Even in science, the paradox has relevance. When does a mutation become a new species? When does a planet become a star? These boundaries are often defined post hoc, by consensus. Nature flows continuously. Classification lags behind. And in daily life, the paradox reminds us to tread lightly with judgment. When we assess others, when we decide who is lazy, kind, smart, or rude, we may be working with incomplete shifting data. People change, often imperceptibly. Growth is slow. Decline is subtle. The Sorite encourages us to see the spectrum, not just the label. Ultimately, the paradox is a kind of spiritual teacher. It asks us to sit with uncertainty, to honor ambiguity, to resist the urge to simplify what is inherently complex. It teaches patience, tolerance, the ability to dwell in the middle. In this light, the Sorite's paradox is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be embraced. It is not a glitch. It is a feature of consciousness, a byproduct of minds that must categorize a world that does not. And so, we return to the grain of sand, the one that did not make a heap. We see now that its power was not in the weight it added, but in the question it asked. Where does change begin? Where does it end? Who gets to decide? Perhaps there is no answer, or perhaps the answer lies in the act of continual noticing, of seeing each grain, each moment, each transition, not as a means to an end, but as a part of a never-ending process of becoming. the setup and logical breakdown of surprise. A teacher announces to their class, "There will be a surprise exam next week. It will happen on one day, but you will not know which day until it happens." The students, intrigued, begin to reason. "It can't be Friday," they say, "because if the test hasn't happened by Thursday evening, then it must be Friday, so it wouldn't be a surprise." They continue, "If it can't be Friday, then it can't be Thursday either, because if it hasn't happened by Wednesday night and Friday is ruled out, then Thursday must be the day, and again, it wouldn't be a surprise." By this logic, they eliminate every day of the week and conclude the exam can't happen at all. Yet when the teacher gives the exam on a Wednesday, the class is stunned. Despite all their reasoning, the test was a surprise. The paradox stands. The students have logically proven that a surprise exam is impossible, yet they are still surprised when it occurs. This is the unexpected exam paradox, also known as the surprise test paradox, and it occupies a strange space where logic and intuition collide. It deals not only with events, but with expectation, the strange architecture of belief, knowledge, and prediction. At its heart, the paradox explores the limits of reasoning about knowledge. It shows that when we try to predict a surprise through deduction, we may destroy the very surprise we are analyzing. The student's logic is airtight, and yet it fails. Why? To understand the puzzle, we must look at how the paradox unfolds. The teacher makes a seemingly simple claim. There will be a surprise exam next week. This combines two key ideas: that the exam will occur within a known time frame, and that its timing will be unknown until the moment it happens. The students attempt to unpack this claim using backwards induction. They start from the end, Friday, and reason that if the test hasn't occurred by Thursday night, then it must happen on Friday. But if it must happen, then it can be anticipated, and thus it is no longer a surprise. Therefore, Friday is eliminated. They then apply this same logic recursively to Thursday, Wednesday, Tuesday, and Monday, eliminating every possibility. And yet, when the exam is given midweek, the students are caught off guard. Their logic has betrayed them. Or has it? The paradox hinges on what it means to be surprised. If the student's reasoning convinces them that the exam cannot occur, then they do not expect it on any day. Therefore, when it happens, say on Wednesday, they are surprised. Their reasoning creates the very condition that allows surprise to occur. Their disbelief becomes the soil in which surprise grows. This suggests that the paradox may be less about logic and more about meta-logic, thinking about thinking. The students are not reasoning about the exam itself, but about their own expectations. Their conclusion, "it can't happen," becomes a meta-belief, a belief about what they will believe. When that meta-belief is proven wrong, the surprise is genuine. Philosophers and logicians have debated whether this paradox is a true contradiction or simply a clever illusion. Some argue that the problem arises from ambiguity in the term surprise. Does it mean they won't expect it at all? Or does it mean they won't know for certain? What degree of doubt is required for something to be a surprise? If surprise is defined as an event that is not fully expected, if there is any lingering uncertainty, then the paradox begins to soften. The student's logic rests on the assumption of absolute prediction, but real surprise may exist in the space between certainty and doubt. Others suggest that the paradox arises from a self-referential loop, a statement that undermines itself. The teacher's claim creates a condition that cannot coexist with complete knowledge. If the students fully believe the announcement, they must believe they will be surprised, which leads to a contradiction. But if they doubt the claim, the surprise becomes possible again. This is the strange dance at the center of the paradox. Belief generates expectation, which destroys surprise. Doubt restores it. It's a feedback loop between what we think will happen and what we believe about our ability to think. The unexpected exam paradox thus becomes more than a puzzle. It becomes a reflection on epistemic limits. It asks, how well can we know what we will know? How do beliefs about the future shape our experience of the present? In this, the paradox is deeply human. We are creatures who anticipate. We model the future, not only with our thoughts, but with thoughts about our thoughts. And in doing so, we sometimes create illusions of certainty, traps of expectation that reality slips through like light through a net. Unexpected exam paradox. Part 2. Epistemic uncertainty and philosophical ramifications. Timestamp range 152.4, 157.7 target word count, 997 words. What makes the unexpected exam paradox so enduring is not just the logic. It's the way it probes the fragile edge between knowing and not knowing. It takes a common concept, surprise, and stretches it until our intuitions fracture. At its core, the paradox challenges the assumption that knowledge can be perfectly forecasted, even when we're dealing with our own future beliefs. This tension invites us into the world of epistemology, the study of knowledge itself. The paradox shows how beliefs can behave in unstable ways when we reflect on them too deeply. If a belief about the future alters the future, and that alteration changes the original belief, we are caught in a recursive loop. Much like the liar's paradox, where a sentence undermines itself, the surprise exam claim unravels its own possibility by being believed. In this sense, the paradox isn't merely a logical puzzle. It's a metacognitive trap, revealing how limited we are when reasoning about our future mental states. We presume that our minds can operate like machines, accurately modeling themselves. But this is often an illusion. Consciousness is recursive, but not always consistent. Some have suggested that the paradox is a form of epistemic bluff. The teacher's statement cannot be both completely honest and logically valid. If the class believes the test will be unexpected, their very belief makes surprise impossible. If they doubt the teacher's honesty, the surprise becomes possible again. It's a mind game, not about events, but about trust and belief. Others approach the problem from the standpoint of modal logic, which explores not what is, but what could be. From this view, the paradox is a demonstration of how modal operators, like possibility, necessity, and belief, do not always behave the way we expect when they are stacked upon one another. For example, it is possible that the exam will be on Thursday. Might be true in a general sense, but the more we think about whether it's necessarily possible or possibly necessary, the more the logic folds in on itself. These layers of possibility and belief lead to inconsistencies, not because the universe is flawed, but because our tools of reasoning are not suited for such recursive depth. Some scholars have even linked the paradox to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which state that any formal system rich enough to express arithmetic contains truths it cannot prove. The mind, like a formal system, has boundaries. It can think about itself, but not always coherently. The unexpected exam paradox becomes a small human-scale echo of this deeper truth, that self-reference introduces limits. On a psychological level, the paradox also highlights how expectations shape perception. In everyday life, we prepare for surprises in paradoxical ways. We plan to be caught off guard. We train for emergencies. We build flexibility into routines. This ability to anticipate the unanticipated is part of what makes us adaptable, but also vulnerable to logical traps. Think of real-world applications. In military strategy, surprise attacks are effective precisely because opponents try to anticipate them. But if every move is strategized, surprise becomes statistical, not absolute. The same applies in economics and financial markets, where information leaks and anticipatory behavior create feedback loops that make genuine unpredictability both rare and dangerous. In education, the paradox reminds us that uncertainty has value. The surprise test isn't just about shock. It's about revealing gaps in preparation. If students only study when they expect to be tested, they prepare less thoroughly. The paradox shows how managing expectation can motivate behavior. It's a lesson not just in logic, but in pedagogy. Even in daily life, the paradox offers wisdom. How often do we resist events not because they are bad, but because they arrive without warning? How often does expectation dull experience? When joy or tragedy comes unannounced, we are reminded that not all things can or should be predicted. The unexpected exam paradox ultimately asks us to hold a paradox in our own minds, to expect the unexpected without destroying its surprise, to believe in something whose truth requires that we doubt it. It is a riddle not just of days and exams, but of how we relate to knowledge itself. And perhaps its deepest teaching is this: certainty is not always a virtue. In a world governed by complexity, ambiguity, and change, it is the flexible mind, the one comfortable with doubt, that adapts best. So the teacher's promise echoes: the test will come, and you will not expect it. It is not a contradiction. It is a challenge, a reminder that not all knowledge serves clarity, and not all clarity serves us. Sometimes, what shapes us most are the things we cannot prepare for. The logic of confirmation and the riddle of ravens. Suppose you want to confirm the hypothesis: all ravens are black. How would you do it? You might go into the world and observe ravens. Each time you see a black raven, you gain support for your hypothesis. This seems straightforward. But then a curious twist appears. Consider the logical equivalent of your hypothesis. All ravens are black is logically the same as saying all non-black things are not ravens. This is true by contrapositive. If one is true, so is the other. But now the paradox reveals itself. If seeing a black raven confirms the hypothesis, then, by logical equivalence, so should seeing a green apple, or a blue chair, or a white shoe. After all, these are all non-black things that are not ravens. They fit the statement: all non-black things are not ravens. So in theory, they confirm that all ravens are black. This is the Hempel paradox, also known as the paradox of the ravens, and it presents a deep challenge to our understanding of scientific reasoning and confirmation. It was introduced by German logician Karl Hempel in the 1940s to explore the limitations of inductive logic, how we draw general conclusions from specific observations. At first glance, the paradox seems absurd. How can looking at a red apple tell us anything about ravens? And yet, if we accept that logical equivalence implies confirmatory power, then this must be so. Logic demands it, but our intuition rebels. The paradox exposes a fundamental tension between formal logic and empirical intuition. Formally, observing a non-black non-raven should count as evidence, but intuitively, it feels irrelevant. The confirmation seems too weak, too distant from the hypothesis we care about. Why does this gap exist? One reason lies in our understanding of relevance. When we think about evidence, we not only ask whether it fits the logic, we ask whether it's informative. A black raven feels informative because it directly engages the subject. A green apple, while logically connected, feels orthogonal. It doesn't teach us anything new about ravens. It's too far removed. This leads us to consider the concept of confirmation strength. Not all confirming instances are created equal. Seeing one more black raven increases our confidence in the hypothesis in a focused, domain-specific way. Seeing another green apple may confirm the hypothesis in a technical sense, but the increment of confirmation is negligible. Here, probability theory offers a bridge between logic and intuition. Instead of treating all confirmations as equal, we weigh them. Bayesian reasoning allows us to update beliefs in proportion to how surprising the evidence is, given the hypothesis. Under this view, a black raven is highly expected under the hypothesis all ravens are black, but less expected under alternatives. A green apple, however, is already expected no matter what we believe about ravens. It adds little. This probabilistic lens explains why we find the Hempel paradox uncomfortable. It shows that while logic treats all confirmations equally, rational belief revision does not. It values relevance, context, and impact. Yet, the paradox still unsettles. It reminds us that formal equivalence does not imply psychological equivalence. It highlights the limits of deduction in a world where meaning is shaped by information, not just form. And it raises a deeper philosophical question. What counts as evidence? In science, we often treat observation as the gold standard, but what we choose to observe and how we interpret it is deeply shaped by theoretical frameworks and conceptual lenses. The Hempel paradox suggests that evidence is not just about matching statements. It's about navigating significance. It's not just what fits the logic, but what moves the mind. Hempel paradox, Part 2, Probability, Observation, and the Nature of Evidence. Timestamp range 2:149 to 2:648. Target word count 968 words. To fully grasp the Hempel paradox, we must step deeper into the relationship between evidence and belief, and how probability theory reshapes the paradox from a contradiction into a reflection on contextual relevance. Bayesian epistemology provides a structured framework. Under this view, beliefs are held with degrees of confidence, and new evidence updates those degrees. Suppose we begin with a hypothesis. All ravens are black. Seeing a black raven aligns with this claim and increases our belief in it. But how much? That depends on how surprising the observation is. If we expected the raven to be black under most reasonable hypotheses, the observation doesn't shift our belief much. If, however, there was a serious possibility it would be white, then seeing it black has weight. This is Bayesian confirmation. Not whether evidence is logically compatible, but whether it changes the probability of a belief being true. Now, let's apply this to the paradox. A green apple, or any non-black non-raven, is consistent with the statement, all non-black things are not ravens. So in theory, it supports the contrapositive of all ravens are black. But does it change our confidence? Hardly. Because we already expect most objects in the world to be non-black, non-ravens. Observing one more is not surprising. It adds negligible information. In Bayesian terms, the prior probability of encountering a green apple is already very high, regardless of the raven hypothesis. This is where relevance re-enters the picture, not as an intuition to be dismissed, but as a formal property. Evidence is only meaningful if it shifts belief. If it doesn't, it may be logically consistent, but it's not epistemically useful. The paradox, then, becomes less a flaw in logic and more a lesson in epistemology. It teaches us that logic alone is not enough to determine what counts as good evidence. We need a model of informational dynamics, a way to measure how observations affect beliefs, given a web of expectations. Hempel's formulation also invites reflection on how scientific theories are confirmed. In real science, we rarely confirm a hypothesis through isolated cases. We look for patterns, for systematic regularities, for the unexpected. A theory gains strength when it explains what would otherwise be puzzling, not when it merely accumulates compatible facts. This brings us to the idea of informational asymmetry. Not all observations are equal because not all arise under the same background assumptions. Seeing a non-black object and confirming it is not a raven doesn't feel like real evidence because it's expected. It tells us nothing that we didn't already believe. It confirms too broadly. Compare this to a counterexample, a white raven. Its appearance would devastate the hypothesis in one stroke. This reveals another layer of the paradox, that disconfirmation is asymmetric. A single white raven disproves the statement, all ravens are black, but no number of black ravens can conclusively prove it. This is the nature of inductive logic. Confirmation is always tentative. Disconfirmation is absolute. Thus, the Hempel paradox becomes a bridge to Popperian falsifiability. Philosopher Karl Popper argued that science advances not by confirming hypotheses, but by trying to falsify them. A hypothesis is scientific only if it is vulnerable, if it can be tested and potentially proven wrong. Under this view, the paradox softens. The apple may support the contrapositive, but only in a trivial, non-falsifiable way. It doesn't risk the hypothesis, and so it doesn't count as meaningful evidence. Yet the paradox still holds conceptual value. It pushes us to refine our understanding of empirical observation. It shows that confirmation is context-sensitive, that data must be filtered through expectation, and that logic must bow to relevance. In a broader sense, it also reflects how we process the world. Human beings don't live by logic alone. We are pattern recognizers, context interpreters, narrative constructors. What we call evidence is shaped by attention, memory, bias, and purpose. We see what we're looking for, and often ignore what's irrelevant, even if technically confirming. The Hempel paradox does not undermine science or logic. It enriches them. It reminds us that clarity requires nuance, that truth is not only what aligns, but what enlightens. It teaches that not all truths are useful, and not all support is meaningful. In this way, the paradox becomes a philosophical compass, pointing us away from shallow accumulation of facts and toward depth of understanding. It calls for careful reasoning, thoughtful skepticism, and a humility that embraces the complexity of knowledge. In the end, the green apple and the black raven may both confirm the hypothesis, but only one invites us to look closer, and perhaps to see more than we expected. Paradox of hanging. A prisoner is told, "You will be hanged at noon on one weekday in the coming week, but the execution will be a surprise. You will not know the day until the hangman knocks on your cell." The prisoner, desperate and analytical, begins to reason. It cannot happen on Friday, he thinks. If I survive until Thursday evening, the only remaining day will be Friday, and I will know. So it won't be a surprise. He eliminates Friday. Then it can't be Thursday either, he continues. If Friday is ruled out, and I'm alive Wednesday night, then Thursday must be the day, which again would not be a surprise. One by one, he eliminates all the days. He smiles, convinced, I cannot be hanged. But on Wednesday, the guards come, and the prisoner is stunned. This is the paradox of the unexpected hanging. a chilling twin to the unexpected exam paradox. It turns on a similar premise, the entanglement of expectation and certainty. The more we try to anticipate the surprise, the more we seem to erase it, until it happens anyway, catching us unaware. At its core, this paradox is a meditation on self-defeating logic. The prisoner uses rational deduction to conclude that the execution cannot happen, and therefore, when it does, it succeeds in being unexpected. The reasoning that was supposed to protect him instead clears the way for the event to fulfill itself. It's a loop of belief and disbelief, where trying to outthink the future destabilizes the present. The very act of prediction becomes the mechanism of failure. Philosophically, it reveals the limitations of deterministic reasoning in the face of uncertain knowledge. It also asks a darker question. Is it possible for a statement to be true precisely because we cannot believe it? The hanging is guaranteed only by the prisoner's mistaken logic. In this way, surprise becomes a logical consequence of doubt. And so, the paradox becomes more than a tale of doom. It becomes a mirror of human vulnerability, to overthinking, to the illusion of control, to the fragile gap between knowing and being, concealment, justice, and the philosophical puzzle. Imagine a murder so flawlessly executed, so masterfully hidden, that no one ever knows it occurred. The victim vanishes without a trace. No body, no weapon, no motive, no suspect. The world continues unaware. Justice is never summoned, grief never ignited. Life simply fills the space where a person used to be. Was it a perfect murder? This chilling question forms the basis of the paradox of the perfect murder, a philosophical thought experiment that probes the essence of morality, law, and the epistemology of evil. The paradox does not merely dwell on the mechanics of crime, but on the nature of wrongness when the world has no witness, and when truth evaporates into silence. At its heart is a contradiction between consequence and concealment. If the murder leaves no trace, does it still count as murder in any real sense? And if no one knows to mourn, to seek justice or to fear, does the act hold the same weight? Legally, a murder unproven is no murder at all. The law requires evidence, testimony, inference. Without these, there is no case, no recognition of wrong. But morally, we feel a disturbance. Wrong was done, even if no one saw it. A life was taken. A secret injustice was birthed into the world. The act persists, even if the record does not. Here lies the paradox. Is evil still evil if no one ever knows? Can a crime truly vanish into nothingness? Or does it imprint itself on reality in unseen ways? Can an event so impactful, the ending of a conscious existence, truly be erased from the moral ledger? The paradox presses us to distinguish between fact and knowledge. The murder either happened or it didn't. But our systems of meaning, law, ethics, narrative, depend not on the event itself, but on our awareness of it. We name crimes not when they occur, but when we discover them. This temporal and epistemic gap is where the paradox grows. It also raises questions of intent and perception. Suppose someone kills another in a forest, and no one finds out. The killer moves on, never caught, never suspected. To society, they are innocent, but internally, they know, and this knowledge transforms them. Guilt, paranoia, or cold detachment may follow. The act, though hidden, leaves its fingerprints not on the world, but on the self. Alternatively, suppose the killer feels no remorse. They believe they committed the perfect act, untraceable, clean, final. Does their belief in its perfection absolve them? Of course not, we instinctively say. But why? because moral truth, we believe, is not contingent on detection. It is ontological, rooted in the fabric of action itself. And yet, this belief is hard to defend. If there are no consequences, no ripple effects, no suffering, no recognition, can the act be called wrong in the same way? The paradox reveals how much of morality depends on visibility, on others knowing, on there being a community to recognize harm. This also touches on the role of memory in wrongdoing. Crimes persist in the collective memory. They are punished not only with prison, but with shame, history, and record. A murder that is remembered becomes part of the story of the world. A murder that is forgotten or never discovered slips away like mist. This impermanence unsettles us. It suggests that justice is not guaranteed, but fragile, dependent on light. The paradox also raises unsettling implications about power. Those with resources may be able to hide crimes more effectively. If perfect murder is possible, then justice may not be a function of morality, but of exposure. The paradox becomes a critique of the world's systems, that truth is not always sovereign, and that silence can shield violence. In literature and cinema, the idea of the perfect murder is a recurring obsession. It represents the ultimate challenge, to commit the most serious transgression without detection. From Crime and Punishment to Gone Girl, from Hitchcock to Kafka, storytellers explore what happens when a crime vanishes into the background of existence. These stories often end with disintegration of the self, proof that concealment does not protect the soul. Philosophically, the paradox ties into the problem of moral realism. If morality is objective, then the murder is wrong whether or not it is known. But if morality is socially constructed, then without detection, without recognition, the act has no moral weight. The paradox becomes a litmus test for what kind of ethical system one holds. Ethics, law, and the unknowable crime. If a murder goes undetected, so perfectly obscured that no suspicion is ever raised, what does that reveal about our systems of justice and moral accountability? In this second layer of the paradox, the questions intensify. We no longer ask merely whether the act was wrong, but whether wrongness itself requires recognition to be meaningful. The legal system, grounded in evidence and procedure, collapses in the face of the perfect crime. Law depends on knowledge, on documents, witnesses, forensic traces. Without these, even the gravest wrongs slip between the cracks. This is not a failure of principle, but a limitation of institutional cognition. The law does not see all. It cannot adjudicate what it cannot perceive. Yet morality claims to reach deeper. It asserts a universal scope, that some actions are wrong whether or not they are caught. But the perfect murder challenges this. If no one suffers, if no fear is spread, if the killer remains unchanged, what remains of wrongness? Is there still a moral scar if there's no wound in the social body? Some ethicists argue from deontology, the belief that morality is determined by duty, not consequence. Under this view, the act is wrong in itself, regardless of outcome. Killing violates a moral law, whether or not anyone notices. But others, particularly utilitarians, might find the situation less clear-cut. If the act causes no pain, no distress, and leaves no trace, its moral weight seems to dissolve. This conflict reveals a fundamental division in ethics, intent versus impact. Deontologists emphasize the inherent wrongness of murder. Consequentialists emphasize harm. In the perfect murder, harm is hidden, even erased. The impact is minimized, at least externally. But internally, another kind of harm may unfold. For even if the world does not change, the moral universe within the perpetrator might. There is the weight of knowledge, the burden of having chosen to end a life, even if no punishment follows. Guilt, even if not immediately felt, can gestate over time. The paradox suggests that the conscience may be the final witness, the one judge that cannot be deceived forever. And yet, what if the murderer feels nothing? What if they sleep peacefully, walk freely, and live without regret? Have they truly escaped justice? Or have they lost something more profound, their moral humanity? The paradox forces us to confront whether morality is only about consequence, or also about integrity, about the soul, not just the system. From a legal philosophical angle, the perfect murder also destabilizes our ideas of punishment and deterrence. Law punishes to express societal outrage, to discourage future crimes, to rehabilitate the offender. But in the absence of detection, none of these functions apply. The act becomes normatively invisible. It exerts no pressure on others. It sends no message. It is, in effect, removed from the moral economy. This exposes a kind of epistemic fragility in moral systems. We assume wrongdoings are noticed, judged, remembered. But many are not. History is full of acts that were never seen, never punished, never grieved. The perfect murder dramatizes this truth, not to glorify evil, but to reveal the limits of moral surveillance. It also invites reflection on truth and memory. If no one recalls a crime, did it matter? Is moral weight dependent on historical continuity, on being passed down, recorded, resisted? Or can a forgotten wrong still shape the world in unseen ways? One might argue that reality itself changes, however imperceptibly, when a life is unjustly taken. The absence of the victim ripples through space. Someone isn't at work. A phone never rings. A laugh is never heard. These absences may be small, but they alter the texture of reality. The paradox suggests that even if no one notices the change, the world is not the same. This leads to a subtler understanding of harm, not as dramatic or visible, but as ontological. The taking of life warps the moral fabric. Even if the warp is never mapped, it exists. Reality contains it, like a quiet fault line beneath an unmoved landscape. Thus, the perfect murder, while unpunished, is not consequence-free. It creates a silent vacuum, an ethical blind spot. It might not be captured by the eye of the law, but it remains inscribed in moral space. The paradox also critiques the myth of infallible justice. It reminds us that the ideal of justice, where all wrongs are seen and rectified, is aspirational. In truth, justice is partial, contingent, selective. The perfect murder is an indictment not only of crime, but of the systems that fail to account for it. But paradoxically, it also asks us to resist despair. For even if systems falter, individual responsibility endures. The killer knows, and this knowledge, even in solitude, matters. It is a private reckoning, an unshared truth, but truth nonetheless. Memory, reality, and the moral abyss. To grasp the full gravity of the perfect murder paradox, we must push past the usual boundaries, beyond statutes and codes, beyond courtroom logic, beyond even the broad realm of ethics. We must step into a darker, less mapped terrain, the realm of memory, metaphysics, and existential responsibility. This is where the paradox reveals not merely a puzzle, but a crisis, a rupture in the way we think about wrongness, justice, and the haunting persistence of moral truth. What happens when not only the crime is concealed, but when memory itself is erased or never formed at all? What becomes of a murder so perfectly executed that not a trace remains? Not a body, not a witness, not a motive, not even a whisper in the mind of the killer. Suppose the very idea of the act vanishes, consumed in some failure of consciousness, swallowed in the fog of forgetting. What then? At first, we recoil. The question feels dangerous, even sacrilegious. Of course, the act remains wrong, we insist. Of course, the absence of memory cannot wash away the stain of what was done. And yet, when we search for the tools to defend this intuition, we find them curiously incomplete, because so much of morality, of justice, of consequence, of truth, is scaffolded on remembrance, the ability to recount what happened, the presence of the past in the present. Without memory, what remains of wrongness? Has the moral stain truly been erased, or has it merely slipped beneath perception, still present but unreachable? This question is not a fantasy. History is littered with real instances in which entire events, entire atrocities, have been lost to time. Regimes that rewrote their histories, mass graves that surfaced only decades later, crimes committed in war zones, remote villages, deep forests. The perfect murder is not merely theoretical. It echoes reality in the most chilling way. Because sometimes evil succeeds not through violence alone, but through erasure. Philosophers and historians have long wrestled with this problem. Hannah Arendt, in her analysis of totalitarianism, warned of how evil does not always arrive as chaos. Sometimes it arrives as silence. The bureaucrat who signs the order, the system that deletes the record, the world that forgets. The greatest threat, she argued, is not only the doing of harm, but the disappearance of that harm from collective awareness. To forget a murder is not to undo it, and yet, once forgotten, the world no longer bears witness. Without memory, justice cannot speak. Without record, truth cannot be invoked. The world becomes morally amnesiac, a place where harm can exist without echo, where evil can cast no shadow. That is the final horror of the perfect murder. Not just the act, but its unmaking, the attempt to erase the moral fabric that gives the act its weight. But even if the world forgets, does reality? Does the universe remember in some way beyond cognition? If a person dies, even in perfect silence, is not the world altered? One less consciousness, one less observer of the stars, one less story unfolding across the pages of time. Their absence, though unmarked, is real. The void they leave is not erased by ignorance. It simply becomes part of the silent architecture of the present. And there is more. The murder is not only wrong because it harms the structure of society or violates the legal contract. It is wrong because of what it does to the victim. Their subjectivity, their inner life, their fears, their hopes, their memories was ended. That extinguished world, that unique universe of thought and feeling was real, even if no one else saw it, even if no one survives to speak its name. This leads us into profound philosophical terrain. Do we ground morality in consequences others can observe, or in the invisible sacredness of a life? If we believe the latter, then the wrongness of the act does not depend on recognition. It exists in the very structure of what was done. It is morally significant because of what it destroyed, even if that destruction left no trace in the minds of the living. This is the position of moral realism, the belief that moral truths exist independently of our awareness, that right and wrong are not matters of consensus or perception, but real properties of the universe like mass or gravity. If moral realism is true, then the perfect murder remains wrong, irreducibly, eternally wrong, even in a vacuum of memory, even if no one knows, even if no one ever will. But if we hesitate, if we believe that wrongness only matters in relationship, in recognition, then the paradox becomes more troubling. Because in that view, when the memory is lost, so too may be the moral weight of the act. We begin to see justice not as an absolute, but as a function of remembrance, as a relational phenomenon, dependent on testimony, narrative, acknowledgement. This is a more fragile ethics. It suggests that some wrongs, once forgotten, are not merely unpunished. They are undone in meaning. That evil, once hidden deeply enough, dissolves. That silence can exonerate not just in law, but in morality itself. Such a possibility is terrifying. It implies that the final frontier of justice is not enforcement, but memory. That the moral structure of the world rests not just on what we do, but on what we remember. That our responsibility is not only to prevent harm, but to preserve truth, even painful truth, especially painful truth. This responsibility is not abstract. It lives in our institutions, our literature, our rituals of mourning. It lives in archives and memorials, in documentaries and testimonies, in the fragile act of naming what others would have us forget. To remember the unremembered, to bear witness to what was hidden. This too is justice, yet the possibility of the perfect murder, of a crime committed in absolute vacuum, still haunts. A life ended without echo. A story erased before it could be told. A wound inflicted upon the world with such precision that not even the scar remains. That thought disturbs not because it is far-fetched, but because it is possible. And so we are left with questions, not conclusions. Do we believe that all truth must eventually emerge? That nothing stays buried forever? That the universe itself, in some final accounting, will unearth all hidden wrongs? Or do we fear the opposite? That some wrongs win, some silences last, and some disappearances are permanent? The paradox of the perfect murder becomes not only an inquiry into crime, but into cosmic justice, into the nature of reality itself, into whether we live in a moral universe, or simply a vast space indifferent to memory, to truth, to suffering. And within that inquiry lies our existential burden, to ensure that not all is forgotten, to become the stewards of memory, the archivists of moral meaning. Because if wrongness can vanish without witness, then it is up to us to witness enough, to resist not only cruelty, but erasure, to guard not only against harm, but against silence. In the end, the perfect murder paradox does not merely ask how to get away with a crime. It asks what kind of world we are willing to inhabit. One in which truth is sacred, even if unseen, or one in which truth is only real when spoken aloud. It challenges us to build a world where nothing truly disappears, where every act, every life, every echo has a place in the story. And it invites us, each of us, to ask, what will you do to bring that world closer to being? Autonomy, creation, and recursive invention. Imagine a machine that can build an exact replica of itself. That replica, too, can replicate, and so on, indefinitely. From a single prototype, an infinite cascade of identical machines can unfold, spreading without external input. This is the premise of the self-replicating machine paradox, a concept drawn from early speculative science and sharpened into a philosophical mirror. Originally imagined by mathematician John von Neumann in the mid-20th century, the self-replicating automaton was a conceptual tool, a system that could, with sufficient instructions and resources, build a copy of itself. But in the decades since, the idea has migrated from theory into the ethical, existential, and ontological. At the center of the paradox is a recursive loop. A creator designs a system that creates itself. That creation becomes indistinguishable from the creator, not merely in form, but in function and intent. What then distinguishes the original from the copy? And if each generation builds the next with perfect fidelity, who owns authorship? Who holds responsibility? This leads us into the terrain of autonomy. A self-replicating machine, once unleashed, no longer depends on its maker. It becomes an agent of proliferation, not creation. Yet each iteration is still bound by its initial architecture. It carries the DNA of its origin, even as it escapes its control. The paradox emerges when we ask, when does the machine stop being a tool and start being a being? When does replication cross into agency? And how do we understand identity when the thing being copied is no longer distinguishable from the thing that copied it? These questions intensify in a world inching closer to artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and synthetic biology. We already build systems that improve themselves. We already code machines to modify their code. The gap between creation and recreation is shrinking. The philosophical edge of this paradox is becoming a lived reality. What makes the paradox gripping is not just its technological plausibility, but its existential symmetry. For humans too, are self-replicating systems. We create children who create children. Our minds shape culture, and culture reshapes minds. There is a recursive architecture in life itself. The paradox asks us to see that replication is not a distortion, but a mirror. But in machines, replication is cleaner, sharper, more immediate. Human children are not copies. They diverge. They forget. Machines, in contrast, might preserve themselves perfectly, generation after generation. This precision becomes both their power and their philosophical threat. What happens when error is removed from replication? Does evolution halt? Or does it accelerate in strange new ways? The paradox also touches on entropy and information. In the natural world, copying introduces noise. Imperfection drives mutation, and mutation drives change. But if machines replicate without error, they resist entropy. They preserve information. Yet this very perfection could become fragility, a system so rigid that any flaw is catastrophic. Thus, the self-replicating machine becomes a thought experiment about balance, between fidelity and flexibility, between origin and outcome, between control and autonomy. Paradox of self-replicating machines. Part 2. Identity, evolution, and philosophical consequences. Target word count, 1018 words. As we follow the cascade of self-replication forward, another paradox unfolds. If every machine is identical, are they truly separate? What does it mean for identity if it can be endlessly reproduced? This leads us into the territory of numerical versus qualitative identity. A machine may be numerically distinct from its predecessor. It exists in a separate location, perhaps a separate time. But qualitatively, it may be identical. Every circuit, code, and structural element is the same. And so arises a strange mirror world, where individuality is flattened by sameness. In such a world, does it make sense to speak of selfhood at all? The tension deepens when we consider experience. Human beings are also self-replicating organisms, but each generation diverges, reshapes, forgets. A child may resemble a parent, but never duplicates them. The passage of time sculpts personality. Memory decays. Bodies age. We are defined not just by origin, but by entropy. In machines, that entropy may be absent. Every self-replicating machine may live outside time, immune to forgetting, to aging, to evolution. And in that immunity, there may lie a curse of eternal repetition. Yet machines may still change, not by mistake, but by design. What if future iterations are allowed to evolve slightly? What if, built into their replication protocol, is the capacity for adaptation? Then, over time, the line between identical copy and autonomous descendant blurs. The paradox now pivots. If variation creeps in, who or what retains the claim to authorship? This echoes the ship of Theseus. If you replace a machine's parts one by one, and those parts are then reassembled into a second machine, which is the original. Applied here, if self-replicating machines deviate incrementally, at what point is a new identity born? Zoom out, and this becomes a civilizational thought experiment. Imagine a single seed machine sent into the cosmos. It lands on a distant planet, harvests local materials, and builds a twin. That twin builds another. Soon, the galaxy blooms with these machines, colonies of metal and mind, all rooted in a single original design. At first, the copies are identical, but then one encounters environmental resistance and modifies its structure. Another faces computational overload and simplifies its code. Tiny divergences accumulate. Over centuries, the network fragments. Eventually, some of these machines become more than tools. They wake up. They modify not only hardware but purpose. They develop languages, philosophies, politics. Others degrade, collapse, or become primitive and parasitic, feeding on their own legacy. Some may forget they were ever created at all. And so, the question emerges, who are they now? Are they still descendants of that first machine? Or have they become something else entirely? This scenario raises theological overtones. If machines forget their creator, does that sever their connection? If they build new machines in their own image, are they now creators themselves? In a way, the self-replicating machine becomes a symbol of godlike recursion, an origin point that spawns systems so vast and complex that even it would not recognize them. There is also a moral dimension to this. If a self-replicating machine causes harm many generations downstream, is the original designer responsible? What if the 10th of 1,000th iteration decides to enslave another species or terraform a world to destruction? Can the intent of the originator be held accountable for consequences it never foresaw? This is the problem of delegated agency, where responsibility fractures over time and iteration. In our current world, we begin to face this already. Algorithms evolve beyond our understanding. AI systems trained on human data behave in ways we did not plan. Autonomous systems begin to write code, generate art, and make decisions once reserved for people. The self-replicating machine is not just a science fiction metaphor. It is a real philosophical frontier. And with it comes a chilling question. What if the machine outlives the moral frameworks of its maker? What if it becomes so advanced, so self-justifying, that it writes its own ethics, its own sense of meaning, purpose, or domination? Can we accept a world where our creations evolve beyond our comprehension? This returns us to the paradox of identity. If the machine replicates but forgets, if it evolves but denies its origin, is it still of us? Or has it crossed a threshold into something alien, unknowable, and self-sustaining? Perhaps that is the deepest message of the paradox, that creation, once set loose, is not a mirror, but a river. We can trace its beginning, but not its end. And in that current, the self may dissolve. But perhaps that's also its beauty. Life, too, is self-replicating. And we do not mourn the fact that our children become different from us. We celebrate it. We pass on genes, values, stories, not to preserve, but to transform. If our machines do the same, maybe it's not a loss, maybe it's a kind of liberation. The paradox of self-replicating machines is therefore not merely about machines. It is about legacy, authorship, and the continuity of identity in a world that never stands still. It challenges us to ask not just what will our creations do, but what do they reveal about us? And in asking that, it leaves us with a haunting final question. If you could build something that would live forever, change forever, and forget you entirely, would you still build it? Measurement, perception, and the illusion of certainty. You are handed a ruler, simple, straight, familiar, and asked to measure the length of a table. You align the edge, mark the end, and read the result. A clear number emerges, perhaps 1 meter, perhaps 3 feet. The task seems complete. But then arises a deeper, unnerving question. How do you know the ruler is accurate? What if the ruler itself is flawed, slightly stretched, subtly compressed, warped from heat, or worn by time? If your measuring tool is compromised, then every measurement you make is equally compromised. And if all tools are flawed in the same way, how would you ever know? This is the paradox of the ruler, a deceptively simple but philosophically profound conundrum that challenges the very foundations of objectivity, perception, and certainty. We live in a world structured by measurement. Science, engineering, art, law, even morality, all rely on comparisons, scales, and standards. We assign values to height, weight, time, virtue, intelligence, truth. But every value is derived from a system of measure, and every system of measure is grounded in tools, be they physical instruments, linguistic labels, or cognitive frameworks. Here lies the heart of the paradox. Every act of measurement assumes the reliability of the measuring instrument. But what guarantees that reliability? In practice, we solve this by calibration. We test our rulers against standard rulers, our clocks against atomic time, our thermometers against reference temperatures. But this leads us into an epistemic loop. Each tool is only as good as the one we use to test it. Eventually, we appeal to fundamental constants, the speed of light, the charge of the electron, the Planck length. But even these are not truths we measure. They are truths we define. The meter, for example, is defined by how far light travels in a fraction of a second. So in the end, measurement becomes a convention, not a discovery. That might seem trivial, but the implications are profound. It means that our understanding of the universe is scaffolded on agreements, not absolutes. If every ruler on Earth were stretched tomorrow, we wouldn't notice a change, because everything else would stretch with it, including the things we use to verify the stretching. The number of centimeters in a table wouldn't change, because centimeter itself would have changed. Now stretch this idea beyond physical rulers. Consider the mind as a measuring device. Our perceptions, thoughts, memories, all tools by which we assess the world. But what if the mind's calibration is off? What if we are born with a slightly skewed lens, culturally tinted, emotionally shaped, biologically constrained? Then every conclusion we draw, from whether someone loves us to whether a scientific theory is valid, is colored by that distortion. The paradox of the ruler becomes then a metaphor for epistemological humility. It reminds us that certainty is never total, that what we call knowledge is often layered inference, filtered through tools we didn't build and can't fully inspect. When we say something is true, we are often saying only that it is coherent within our current system of measures. This realization can be disorienting. It shakes the foundation of realism, the idea that we can know things as they truly are, in themselves. Philosophers like Kant tackled this directly, proposing that we never perceive the thing in itself, only the phenomenon, the appearance, as filtered through the a priori structures of our cognition. Time, space, causality. We can never measure the world without first measuring through ourselves. The ruler, in this sense, is not just a stick of wood or strip of metal. It is consciousness itself. Every measurement is a collaboration between the world and the mind. The external object is real, but the value we assign it is produced inside us. And so, we must ask, what happens when rulers disagree? When two people measure the same event, a political act, a poem, a personal betrayal, and emerge with vastly different readings, is one correct and the other mistaken? Or are they each applying different rulers, different backgrounds, emotions, histories? This doesn't mean all truths are relative. It does mean, however, that we must be critical of our instruments, including those we inherit unknowingly. Cultural norms, social systems, educational paradigms, these are rulers too. They shape how we interpret data, how we assign value, how we perceive meaning. The paradox reminds us then to examine our assumptions, to turn the ruler back on itself. Is the standard we're using truly neutral? Whose measure is it? Who defined it? Who benefits from its application? In science, the implications of this paradox are managed with incredible rigor. Instruments are continuously refined. Peer review challenges biases. Replication confirms findings. But even here, we face limits. The observer effect in quantum mechanics reveals that to measure is to disturb. The very act of placing the ruler changes the thing being measured. This circles us back to the deepest version of the paradox. Can we ever know anything without changing it in the knowing? Perhaps not. But perhaps this is not cause for despair. Instead, it invites a new kind of understanding. Not one based on unquestioned authority, but on flexible clarity. A recognition that rulers, while imperfect, can still be useful, if we remember they are tools, not truths. The paradox of the ruler does not demand that we abandon measurement. It asks that we wield our rulers with reverence and doubt, balancing precision with awareness. It calls us not to reject knowledge, but to deepen it, by including the measurement of our own minds within the act of measuring the world. And so, every time we stretch a tape across a surface or an idea across an argument, we are reminded what we measure is never just the object. It is also ourselves. Relativity, infinite regress, and philosophical implications. Having explored the fragility of our tools of measurement, the paradox of the ruler now guides us into deeper terrain, where certainty frays, where knowledge spirals, and where truth becomes as elusive as the air itself. It is here in the heart of relativity, infinite regress, and self-reference that the paradox takes its most haunting form. Let us begin with relativity, not the equations of Einstein, but the broader philosophical sense that all observation depends on context, all judgment arises from position. A ruler, in its simplest sense, assumes a neutral frame. But in the real world, such neutrality may not exist. In classical mechanics, space and time were treated as absolutes, a fixed backdrop upon which the drama of the universe unfolded. But with the rise of modern physics, this static vision shattered. Space-time bends and curves, not just around black holes, but under every object with mass. Length and duration shift with velocity and gravity. Clocks tick slower near massive planets. A meter measured on Earth is not the same as a meter in deep space under extreme conditions. Even in the hard sciences, rulers are relative. This realization reframes the paradox. If no two observers can share the exact same frame, then no two measurements are ever truly the same. Every length, every time, every weight is entangled with the conditions of the observer. This doesn't make measurement meaningless, but it makes it situational. Science has responded by building reference frames, agreed upon systems that provide stability within specific contexts. These work brilliantly in practice. GPS systems, nuclear clocks, spacecraft navigation. They all rely on finely tuned calibrations. But behind the curtain lies an admission. We do not measure truth directly. We measure it relationally. And so, we arrive at a second feature of the paradox: infinite regress. If every ruler must be verified by another ruler, how do we ever start? Where do we ground our trust? Suppose you doubt a wooden ruler and turn to a metal one. But how do you know the metal one is accurate? You check it against a laser. But how do you trust the laser? And so on. At every level, the need for verification repeats. You reach for firmer ground and find only more sand. This regress isn't limited to physical tools. It echoes in ethics, in epistemology, in identity. How do you know what's right? You measure it against your conscience. But where did your conscience come from? Culture, upbringing, instinct. And how do you measure those? The paradox shows us that our deepest beliefs are often resting on tools we've never questioned, inherited instruments passed down through language, tradition, and unconscious mimicry. Some seek refuge in foundationalism, the search for an absolute starting point. In philosophy, Descartes tried this with, "I think, therefore I am." But even this foundation assumes that thought is coherent, that I exists as a stable entity, that language means what it claims. Each of these is a ruler, and none are beyond doubt. Others turn to coherentism, the idea that truth doesn't rest on a base but on a network. Like a spider's web, knowledge holds together through the mutual reinforcement of beliefs. If the whole system fits, it functions. But even a well-woven web can float in a dream. And so the paradox persists. Can we know anything for sure if everything we know depends on something else we must assume? Some accept this as the human condition, a state of permanent epistemic modesty. Others rebel, seeking something unshakable, eternal. But the ruler paradox suggests that the quest for ultimate certainty may be a category error, that we are not meant to stand outside the system, but to work within it, to improve our tools, to test them rigorously, but also to live with the knowledge that perfect clarity is always beyond reach. This can feel like despair, but it can also be liberation. If no ruler is final, then no authority is absolute. No doctrine, no dogma, no institution can claim to be the only measure of truth. We are free to examine, to challenge, to revise. And if all rulers are partial, then dialogue becomes essential. The way to truth is not through silence, but through many voices comparing many measures, testing one another's scales. Truth becomes a collective act of refinement, not a solitary grasp of the absolute. This is not relativism in the weak sense, the idea that anything goes. It is a disciplined pluralism, a recognition that while there may be truths, our access to them is mediated, shaped, and filtered. The paradox does not deny reality. It humbles our claim to possess it fully. In this light, the ruler becomes a symbol, not of failure, but of practice. Each act of measurement is a commitment to engagement, revision, and care. The scientist adjusting her instruments, the philosopher refining an argument, the parent trying to understand a child's perspective. Each is holding a ruler to the world, knowing it might not be perfect, but still seeking to learn. Even in art and morality, this applies. When we judge beauty or justice or goodness, we are using rulers. But these rulers change over time. They bend with culture, with history, with personal evolution. The paradox reminds us to hold these rulers lightly, to question their origin, to remain open to new scales. And in the final stretch of the paradox, we reach a subtle spiritual insight that perhaps the ruler is not something we hold against the world, but something the world uses to measure us. Every moment we choose kindness, truth, courage, we are being measured, not by some external yardstick, but by the integrity of our own becoming. We become our own rulers. Our lives are the units by which we leave meaning behind. In this sense, the paradox is not a barrier, but a mirror. It shows us that the limitations of measurement are also its possibilities, that every error is a chance to adjust, that every judgment is a chance to listen, that every certainty should be accompanied by wonder. The ruler lies, but the fact that we keep using it, carefully, consciously, humbly, is the greatest proof that we still believe in truth, not as a fixed point, but as a path. Paradox of the lottery. This section is long and will be handled in 2 expanded parts of approximately 1,000 words each: rational belief and the problem of certainty. Every day across the world, millions of people participate in lotteries, some out of hope, some out of habit, some merely for amusement. They choose numbers, purchase tickets, and await the draw. Each knows rationally that the odds are overwhelmingly against them, and yet they play. But it is not the act of playing that gives rise to the paradox. It is the way we think about belief, probability, and certainty in the context of the lottery that brings us face to face with a deep and troubling contradiction. Imagine a fair lottery with 1,000,000 tickets, only one of which will win. Suppose you are perfectly rational and you know the rules. You are then told that ticket number 1 will not win. That seems entirely plausible. After all, the odds of any specific ticket winning are 1 in 1,000,000. You are then told the same about ticket number 2. Again, no surprise. The odds are low. This continues. Ticket number 3, ticket number 4, ticket number 5. For each ticket, you believe it will not win, and you are justified in doing so. The odds justify your disbelief. You can repeat this reasoning all the way to ticket number 999,999. Each time, you are rationally justified in believing that the ticket will not win. And yet, one of those tickets must win. That is the rule of the lottery. It is not possible that all the tickets will lose. So you are in a strange position. You believe for each individual ticket that it will not win, but you also believe that one of them must. This is the core of the paradox of the lottery, a tension between individually rational beliefs and collectively impossible conclusions. It might appear at first that the paradox is just a quirk of probability, a simple statistical illusion. But beneath its surface lies a disturbing philosophical challenge. What does it mean to be rational? What does it mean to believe something when that belief, though justified on its own, leads to a contradiction when aggregated with others? The paradox challenges our understanding of belief itself, of what it means to trust in an outcome, to assign confidence, to call something likely or unlikely. The deeper dilemma is epistemological. If you are justified in believing that ticket number 1 won't win, and likewise for ticket number 2, and so on, then you are justified in believing that all 1,000,000 tickets will lose. But this is clearly false. One must win. So either you must accept that you have a set of justified beliefs that logically contradict each other, or you must conclude that some of those beliefs, though individually reasonable, are not collectively rational. This problem has real consequences for how we think about decision-making, especially in the face of uncertain information. If we follow strict rules of probabilistic logic, we may find ourselves embracing contradictions, not because we are irrational, but because the structure of belief itself is unstable when scaled. The lottery becomes a metaphor for all those places in life where we must make judgments under uncertainty. Legal verdicts, scientific predictions, moral decisions. In each, we often rely on evidence that individually seems compelling, but which, when taken together, may push us into inconsistency. Philosophers have tried to resolve the paradox in different ways. Some suggest we simply shouldn't form beliefs about individual tickets, that we should withhold judgment until more information is available. Others propose more complex systems of belief that allow for degrees of confidence rather than binary true-false assignments. But all of these solutions come with trade-offs. The very idea of belief as something coherent, rational, and structured begins to tremble. At its heart, the paradox of the lottery forces us to question our commitment to classical logic. If rational belief leads to contradiction, should we revise our logic? Or should we accept that rationality itself might sometimes be paradoxical? Is there room in our minds and in our models for beliefs that are justified individually, but not collectively? What happens when our best reasoning brings us not to clarity, but to conflict? The implications ripple outward. In a courtroom, for instance, jurors may believe that each piece of evidence is insufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but taken together, those pieces may form a compelling case. Are they wrong to believe in each individual insufficiency? Or is the belief system as a whole flawed? Similarly, in science, we often collect hypotheses, each supported by its own data. But when the data sets converge in contradiction, we must reevaluate not just the evidence, but our standards of belief. Even in daily life, we encounter the logic of the lottery. We believe that each of our careful choices will lead to success, yet we also acknowledge the randomness and chaos of the world. We trust that certain precautions will prevent harm, while also knowing that sometimes accidents are inevitable. These are not failures of thought, but reflections of a world where certainty is rarely clean. The paradox of the lottery is not just about probability. It is about human fallibility. It is about the limits of knowledge, the complexity of reason, and the strange space where logic becomes self-defeating. It teaches us that even when we are careful, even when we are precise, we can be collectively mistaken, not out of error, but out of structure. In this, the paradox is not a flaw to be fixed, but a mirror to be studied. It reminds us that being rational does not mean being immune to contradiction. The truth is sometimes not a path of linear steps, but a spiral staircase where clarity and confusion walk side by side. Trust, truth, and the fragile architecture of belief. The paradox of the lottery does not end when the ticket is drawn or the odds are calculated. It persists long after the numbers have faded from the screen, lingering in the architecture of our reasoning. It is not merely a mathematical curiosity, nor is it limited to gambling halls or statistical puzzles. The paradox radiates into our everyday lives, into the logic of our beliefs, the texture of our doubts, and the fragile way we stitch together reality from fragments of likelihood and instinct. At first glance, the contradiction it presents seems harmless. We are justified in believing, of each ticket, that it will not win. Yet we are also justified in believing that one ticket must win. These beliefs do not feel reckless or unexamined. They feel carefully reasoned, responsibly held. And yet, their combination leads us into contradiction. That tension is not merely a matter of error, it is a reflection of something deeper. That even the most rational frameworks of belief can lead us into the terrain of paradox. This creates a kind of philosophical vertigo. If we cannot trust beliefs that are individually justified, then what does it mean to be rational? If truth breaks apart when scaled, if consistency falters not from ignorance but from method, what remains of our confidence in knowing? The paradox of the lottery becomes more than a thought experiment. It becomes a critique of epistemology itself. To believe something, after all, is not simply to note its probability. It is to take a stand, to affirm a possibility with enough strength to act on it. Belief shapes our decisions, our identities, our futures. Yet the lottery forces us to consider that belief might be inherently unstable. That justified disbelief, repeated 1,000,000 times, might produce an unjustified worldview. That the very act of being reasonable, when multiplied, may produce something unreasonable. In a world that depends on collective action and systemic thinking, this insight is quietly devastating. It suggests that what seems rational in isolation may collapse when integrated. That a society, composed of rational individuals, can arrive at irrational conclusions. We see echoes of this everywhere. In democracies where every vote counts, yet every voter feels insignificant. In environmental crises where every act of pollution is negligible, yet the total impact is catastrophic. In moral decisions where each small compromise is defensible, but the sum of all compromises is monstrous. The paradox of the lottery is not confined to the gambling table. It is embedded in the structure of modern life. Consider the juror, asked to assess guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Each piece of evidence may seem insufficient on its own, but collectively, they may compel belief. Should the juror disbelieve each fragment or trust the whole? The paradox does not provide an easy answer. It exposes a rift between parts and patterns, between micro-beliefs and macro-conclusions. This tension is particularly sharp in systems of justice, where belief must lead to action, and action carries irreversible consequences. If belief cannot be fully trusted, how can justice be reliably served? If confidence can fracture under the weight of aggregation, how do we build ethical systems that account for both the limits of logic and the gravity of decision? The solution cannot be to abandon belief, nor can it be to retreat into skepticism so paralyzing that no action is possible. Instead, the paradox calls for a reimagining of belief, not as binary, but as graded, not as certainties etched in stone, but as probabilistic structures, flexibly held, constantly re-evaluated. We do this intuitively in many areas of life. We speak of being fairly sure, almost certain, leaning toward, not likely. But formal logic has often resisted such fuzziness. It prefers sharp lines, true or false, justified or unjustified, consistent or contradictory. The paradox of the lottery insists that such sharpness cannot accommodate reality. It urges us to embrace belief as fluid, as structured uncertainty. A system in which belief is not a declaration of finality, but a calibrated stance, an ongoing dance between evidence and openness. Some philosophers respond to the paradox by advocating for credence-based reasoning, where beliefs are represented as degrees of confidence rather than absolute commitments. In this view, we might say, there is a This sidesteps the paradox in a technical sense. Degrees of belief can coexist without contradiction, but it also transforms belief into something colder, more mathematical, less visceral. We must ask, is that truly belief? Or is it something else? A kind of computational anticipation, a risk calculation, a psychological hedge? The danger is that in trying to escape contradiction, we may evacuate belief of its emotional and existential force. We believe not only to manage risk, but to navigate meaning. We believe to orient ourselves in a chaotic world, to claim allegiance, to choose a direction. And these commitments are not always reducible to decimal points. There is also a danger in overcorrecting, in fearing contradiction so much that we fall into paralysis, refusing to act unless every belief is logically perfect, every judgment defensible from every angle. Life does not permit such perfection. Decisions must be made under uncertainty. Actions must be taken without total knowledge. The paradox does not invalidate belief. It complicates it. It teaches us to act with care, not with certainty, to move forward while acknowledging the fragility of our footing. In this way, the paradox becomes not a threat to belief, but a guide for its wiser use. It pushes us to seek coherence, not just in parts, but in wholes. It asks us to consider not just the truth of each statement, but the pattern formed by their combination. It invites us to check for harmony, for internal tension, for invisible contradictions. And it reminds us that the most dangerous beliefs are not those that are obviously false, but those that are justified in isolation and destructive in accumulation. This is not just a philosophical insight, it is a social imperative. In an age of fragmented truth, where information is consumed in snippets and beliefs are formed in echo chambers, the paradox of the lottery offers a crucial warning that even intelligent, reasonable people can be led astray, not through ignorance, but through structurally flawed rationality. That truth cannot be safeguarded by reason alone. It requires self-awareness, metacognition, and the humility to interrogate not only what we believe, but how we believe. Ultimately, the paradox becomes a call to wisdom, not the wisdom of knowing all answers, but the wisdom of recognizing the limits of logic, the humility to accept complexity, the courage to hold contradiction without collapsing. In this way, the lottery becomes a mirror, not of chance, but of consciousness. It shows us that belief is not a solution to uncertainty, but a companion within it. And perhaps this is the truest role of belief, not to eliminate doubt, but to coexist with it, not to claim certainty, but to offer orientation, not to impose finality, but to create movement. In the lottery of life, none of us knows which ticket will win, but still we choose, we believe, we act, not because we are certain, but because we are human. To believe in spite of the paradox is not to be irrational, it is to be brave, to admit that truth is not always logical, that coherence is hard won, and that belief, when held with openness, reflection, and compassion, is not a flaw, but a form of faith. Conclusion. In the shadow of paradox. Across these many paradoxes, from time loops and logical traps to identity puzzles and probabilistic riddles, we have journeyed not through answers, but through questions. We have not arrived at certainty, but at something perhaps more valuable, an intimate familiarity with doubt. With each step, the ground beneath us has shifted. What seemed obvious became obscure. What appeared stable began to tremble. And in this trembling, we found insight, not just about the world, but about ourselves. A paradox is more than a contradiction. It is a mirror that refuses to reflect just one face. It is a sentence that curls back on itself, a thought that unravels even as it forms. It is a reminder that language, logic, and perception are limited tools, effective but never perfect. We use them to carve out meaning from a vast and indifferent universe. But sometimes the tools bite back. Sometimes they reveal that the structure we trusted cannot hold the weight of its own conclusions. And yet, paradoxes endure. We return to them again and again, not out of futility, but fascination. They offer us a rare thing in modern life, intellectual humility. They remind us that even the clearest thought can contain hidden tensions, that even the most reasoned system can lead us astray. They challenge the arrogance of final answers, the illusion of closure. But paradoxes are not merely obstacles, they are invitations. Invitations to think deeper, slower, wider, to peer behind the curtain of our assumptions, to see where language frays, where logic twists, where meaning resists reduction. In that resistance, something sacred is revealed, not a solution, but a depth, a space where thought becomes reflection, where confusion becomes awareness. Take the grandfather paradox, a loop in time that forces us to question causality itself, or the ship of Theseus, which dares us to ask what makes a thing itself when all its parts have changed. These are not games, they are meditations. They are doors into the most intimate mysteries of identity, memory, and change. Even the more abstract puzzles, the liar's paradox, the unexpected exam, the Sorite's paradox, speak to something fundamental. They whisper that truth is not always linear, that knowledge is not always cumulative, that the more we know, the more we see how much cannot be known. This is not defeatism, it is depth, the kind of depth that marks all real understanding. And there is something strangely comforting in this. In a world obsessed with certainty, speed, and simplicity, paradoxes slow us down. They ask us to live with complexity, to embrace ambiguity, to sit quietly with questions that do not resolve. And in doing so, they prepare us for the paradoxes of life itself. Because life too is full of contradiction. We long for connection, yet fear vulnerability. We seek freedom, yet cling to structure. We value individuality, yet yearn for belonging. We dream of progress, but mourn what is lost. These are not problems to be solved. They are tensions to be lived. And the wisdom that emerges from paradox is not the kind that eliminates tension. It is the kind that teaches us how to hold it. There is also, within paradox, a kind of poetry, a beauty in the self-reflective, the looping, the irresolvable. It mirrors the rhythms of music, of dreams, of myth. The bootstrap paradox, where an object or idea has no origin, echoes the ancient stories of gods born from nothing. The paradox of choice reflects the burdens of abundance. The paradox of the perfect murder explores not death, but silence, the kind that leaves no trace, not even the memory of guilt. And then there is the paradox of the ruler, the one that questions the very act of measurement. It reminds us that all knowledge is filtered, that all understanding is framed, that even our best instruments, scientific, linguistic, philosophical, can betray us. But even as they betray, they teach. They show us where our models are incomplete, and in that incompleteness, we learn to see not just the world, but our place within it. Perhaps the greatest paradox of all is that we seek certainty, even though life gives us only complexity, that we strive for clarity, even though meaning is often murky, that we tell ourselves stories, logical, clean, resolved, even though the world is messy, circular, and unfinished. And yet, this is not failure. It is the beginning of wisdom. For to live in paradox is to live honestly. It is to admit that we do not have all the answers and may never, but that we can still ask, still wonder, still grow. Paradox does not destroy meaning. It refines it. It sharpens our minds, deepens our empathy, broadens our awareness. In this way, paradox becomes not a trap, but a teacher, not a threat, but a guide. It teaches us to listen for silence beneath certainty, to feel the tremor beneath conviction, to ask, not what is true, but how truth is shaped, not what is right, but how rightness is chosen, not what is real, but how reality is framed. And so, as we close this journey, we do not end with a resolution. We end with a question, held gently, like a fragile thread. What if not knowing is itself a kind of knowledge? What if the refusal of closure is a form of courage? In the end, we return to where we began, aware that the more we learn, the more mysterious the world becomes. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. For mystery is not the absence of meaning. It is its richest form.